The build-up to the Russian Civil War began on March 8, 1917 in the capital of Petrograd. With the start of the February Revolution, there was much resentment in the Russian Empire during this period, as they were losing on the Eastern Front during World War I. There was a big rift between the ruling class and the working population, as access to food and water and other basic necessities became scarce due to the war. Mass demonstrations and even violent armed clashes between the revolutionaries and Russian soldiers would break out. Eventually, the garrison in Petrograd sided with the people and forced Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate the throne. The result of the revolution had the revolutionaries forming the Petrograd Soviet, which was led by the likes of Leon Trotsky, Grigory Zinoviev, and Nikolai Chikadze. The Petrograd Soviet often challenged the provisional government in Petrograd, acting in opposition to them. The provisional government was formed post-Tsar abdication. As the months went on, tensions between the provisional government and the Petrograd Soviet would culminate in the October Revolution, which began on November 7th, led by Vladimir Lenin, ending on the same day with the freshly formed Russian Republic being ousted from Petrograd. The October Revolution is what began the Russian Civil War. Post-October Revolution, on January 18, 1918, one of the shortest-lived countries was formed, the Russian Democratic Federal Republic. It would only be 60 days into its existence that the Bolsheviks would dissolve the Constituent Assembly. A week later, on January 25, 1918, at the Third All-Russian Congress of Workers and Soldiers Deputies Soviets, the Russian Socialist Soviet Federative Republic would be formed, in opposition to the RDFR. March 5, 1918 saw Lenin moving the capital of the RSFSR from Petrograd to Moscow, due to the proximity of opposing forces. This was meant to be temporary, but ended up being permanent. It wouldn't be until July 1918 that their constitution would be adopted at the 5th meeting of the Congress. The RSFSR was considered the Soviet Union before the Soviet Union. The RSFSR was Russia itself, not including Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic countries, and Central Asia. 1921 saw a massive downturn in the economic situation in Russia, as most people were being paid in goods instead of the ruble, and most vehicles didn't even work anymore. Industries were not functioning and were at pre-war levels. It wouldn't be until much later that the economy recovered. As the RSFSR was swallowing up land during the Civil War, they began to give these areas autonomy. On December 28, 1922, at the First All-Soviet Congress, the USSR would be formed. Born on April 22, 1817, in Simbirsk, Russia, Lenin grew up in a middle-class family. His parents were Ilya Ulyanov, who was a teacher, and Maria Blank, who stayed at home and took care of Lenin. Lenin's later years saw him founding the League of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class in November of 1895, which is one of the predecessors to the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, which housed the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. 1897 saw Lenin being exiled to Siberia for 3 years with the charge of sedition. Sedition meaning conduct or speech inciting people to rebel against a monarch. His future wife Nadia Krupskaya would join him in exile the next year, with them marrying in July 1898. 1900 would see Lenin returning from exile, now living in Pskov. He immediately began the funding of Iskra, a newspaper for the RSDLP. He would then go to Western Europe, visiting the likes of London, Munich, Geneva, and eventually he would start printing Iskra in Munich. Though this was to the annoyance of the Bavarian police located there. By 1902, it had moved to London. During all this time, the Russian Empire had banned the newspaper, so it had to be smuggled into Russia. 1905 saw the RSDLP starting a revolution that was led by Lenin and Leon Trotsky, though this would eventually be quelled. 1917 saw the Bolsheviks and Germans signing a peace treaty, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which not only offered peace between the Germans and Bolsheviks, but it also the return of Vladimir Lenin to Russia. Leon Trotsky was born on November 7, 1879 in Kherson Governorate, Russia, to David Leontovich and Anna Lvovna. After moving to the town of Nikolaev in 1896, Trotsky started associating with Marxist revolutionaries after he was won over by his future wife Alexandra Sokolovchuk. Sokolovskaya. 1897 saw Trotsky forming the Nikolaev South Russian Workers' Union, as working conditions in Russia at the time were terrible. The rest of 1897 was Trotsky and his union handing out pamphlets and leaflets with revolutionary messaging on them, which came to a head in 1898, where Trotsky and roughly 200 of his men were arrested. It was in March of 1898, while in prison, he began associating with the RSDLP. 1899 saw Trotsky marrying his wife Alexandra Sokolovskaya, though in 1900 he would be exiled to Siberia for 4 years along with his wife. During this time, he started writing for the RSDLP newspaper Iskra. In 1902, adopting the stance that the government needs to be overthrown, instead of only having work reforms. Trotsky would later escape Siberia via a wagon full of hay. He would later end up in London and other cities outside of Russia and Europe. 1903 saw the RSDLP splitting into two separate factions over disagreements of how the party should be run. This is what formed the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. Trotsky ended up siding with the Mensheviks up until 1904. Upon the start of the 1905 revolution, Trotsky returned to Russia secretly, setting up in the city of Kiev and passing out pamphlets before going to St. Petersburg. There he worked with local Bolshevik and Menshevik committees to organize demonstrations and protests. Though, when the revolution failed in 1907, he was exiled once again to Siberia, though on the way there he escaped and made his way to London. In the months following his exile, he would move to Vienna and help the Social Democratic parties there, though he would eventually be back in the coming years. With the coup in Petrograd in March, and the eventual ousting of the Russian Republic from Petrograd, Leon Trotsky negotiated the Brest-Litovsk Treaty with the Central Powers, primarily Germany and the Ottoman Empire. With the collapse of Germany in World War I, Poland, which was a German client state, declared their independence, to the much annoyance of both the Russian Republic and the Bolsheviks. In late 1918, this started a conflict known as the Polish-Soviet War. Nationalism was very heavy in Poland after they declared independence. This caused Poland to build up an army of 80,000 men upon declaration. With the German retreat from Russia beginning, the Germans began to let Bolshevik troops fill the once vacated German lines. The first offensive of the Polish-Soviet War was started on November 18, 1918, with the Soviets being the aggressors. One of the major reasons this war started was because Lenin wanted to connect Germany with Russia. This was done in part because Germany was going through their own revolution at the time. The Polish-Soviet War started when the Soviets entered Polotsk in Belarus and went virtually unopposed all the way up to Minsk. Though ill-equipped militias had formed up to that point, they weren't really any match for the Red Army. The first major battle took place in Vilna, Lithuania, with it happening sometime in February or April of 1919. A major struggle over the city ensued, though the Polish militias in Vilna eventually had to withdraw due to them being ill-equipped. With the Bolsheviks capturing Vilna, the Polish brought 11,000 men to recapture the city. Fighting took place for 3 days before the Polish retook Vilna. After Russia had pushed back forces in Belarus with relative ease, the Polish army commander Stanislav Sobieski planned an offensive into Belarus in August of 1919. The offensive started on August 6, and it only took 2 days for Polish forces to take Slutsk and Minsk. The Bolsheviks in this time took very heavy losses. During this time, plenty of smaller battles had taken place between the Polish and Bolshevik forces, with the Bolsheviks losing the vast majority of these battles. In April of 1920, Poland began their offensive into Ukraine, with the help of the Ukrainian People's Republic. The offensive lasted up until June of 1920. Up until the end of the fighting between Poland and the Bolsheviks, it was mostly in Belarus, but the most major battle of the Polish-Soviet War was in Warsaw, Poland. Bolsheviks up to this point led an offensive into Poland, with Poland having been in retreat since losing possession of Ukraine in the Soviet counteroffensive. The battle would serve as one of the most important battles of the Polish-Soviet War. The Battle of Warsaw took place near Warsaw, Poland, and lasted 13 days. Poland's logistics had reorganized by this time, so their defenses were a lot stronger than any Bolshevik attack, hence why this battle took place near Warsaw and not in Warsaw. Poland over this time dealt heavy casualties to the Bolsheviks, prompting the Bolsheviks to be pushed back and defeated, eventually pushing them back into Belarus, where a final battle took place in Minsk, with the Polish losing that battle. Poland, the Bolshevik Józef Pilsudski was the chief of state for Poland when Poland declared their independence from the Russian Empire. Józef was born on December 5, 1867 in Vilna, governor in the Russian Empire, which is now Lithuania. Józef in his younger years had a dislike for Russian Orthodoxy and the Tsar of Russia at the time. 1885 saw Józef being suspended from Kharkov University for participating in student demonstrations as he was a part of a revolutionary group called Narodnik. 1886 saw Józef trying to get into another university, with the university being aware of his political affiliations. He would be rejected. 1887 saw him being arrested in the city of Vilnius for plotting to assassinate the Tsar. Though this is ambiguous because it was his brother who was a part of the plot, his involvement or knowledge of said plot is unclear. Józef would be sent to Siberia for 5 years. Upon his return, he would join the Polish Socialist Party, helping the Lithuanian branch of the party. 1900, Józef was imprisoned for spreading anti-government ideas. He would then pretend he had a mental illness and escape a mental hospital. He would flee to Austria-Hungary and eventually settle in London. In 1904, he would travel to Japan in an effort to get help for an uprising in Poland, though he would be refused by the Japanese. Józef, in 1905, with the help of the Polish Socialist Party, would lead a general strike that involved 400,000 workers in Poland. The strike would last 2 months before being suppressed by the Russian Empire. By December 22, 1905, Józef called for an uprising in Poland, but it went largely ignored. With the help of Austro-Hungarians in 1906, Józef started a military school in Krakow. They would find much success in killing Russian officials. By 1908, he would turn his resistance group into the Association of Active Struggle, or ZWC in Polish. Józef would begin to train more Polish people unbeknownst to the Russians, as he would train them through sporting clubs. From 1906 to 1914, the ZWC would go from 2,000 to 12,000 men. Józef would serve in World War I under the Austro-Hungarian banner. The Belarus Democratic Republic was proclaimed on March 9, 1918, with the occupation of some parts of Belarus by the Germans. Jan Sereda was appointed the president. Belarus was a big point of contention in the Polish-Soviet War. The Belarusian army, with them pretty much being an extension of the Polish army, had 54,000 soldiers at its peak, with the military participating in many of the battles of the Polish-Soviet War. Though Belarus only participated in 3 major battles of the Polish-Soviet War. The first one being the Battle of Warsaw, that took place on August 12, 1920, where they played a small role in pushing back the Soviets out of Warsaw. After the pushback of the Soviets in Poland, the first major battle that happened for them was on September 11, 1920, with Belarusian and Polish troops meeting Bolsheviks in the city of Korbin, Belarus. The battle lasted up to September 24, 1920, with Belarusian and Polish troops beating back the Bolsheviks, with their final major battle taking place near the Niemen River. Starting on September 20, 1920, the Polish and Belarusian troops had been making their advance into Belarus with a counteroffensive. They met the Bolsheviks on the river of the Niemen, where a firefight broke out. The fight lasted 6 days, with Polish and Belarusians taking the victory. By 1921, the Polish and Soviets signed a peace agreement where Poland would be annexing parts of Belarus along with the Belarusian SSR, thus pushing the BDR into exile up to this day. The Lithuanian Soviet Socialist Republic was founded on December 16, 1918 and lasted up to February 27, 1919, with the Soviets renouncing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, with the Soviets advancing into Lithuania 4 days prior on December 12. The Lithuanian SSR controlled more than half of Lithuania by January 1919. They were stopped by local forces. The Socialist Soviet Republic of Belarus, which was established on January 1st, 1919, they incorporated the cities of Minsk, Rodno, Smolensk, Vitebsk, and Vilna. They were not really autonomous for their brief existence, as the Bolshevik Central Committee said they did not have self-determination. They were then combined with Lithuania to form the Litbel SSR in February of 1919. February 27, 1919, Kazimierz Tchaikovsky founded the Litbel SSR, lasting up to July 30th, 1920, with it being the combination of the Soviet republics of Belarus and Lithuania, with both of them being established in the prior months. Both Lithuania and Belarusian Communist parties were combined on February 27th. The Litbel SSR was a big part of both the Lithuanian War of Independence and the Polish-Soviet War, with them bordering both countries. With Poland advancing into Lithuania and decisively defeating the Bolshevik forces in Vilna on April 15th, the government in Vilna had been evacuated to Minsk. The next month, in May 1919, Poland had advanced into Belarus, being on the outskirts of the city of Minsk. The government then evacuated, but this time to Babarusk. It wasn't until August 1919 that Minsk and Babarusk were captured. September 1919 saw the Bolsheviks recognizing and proposing to sign a peace treaty with Lithuania, thus starting the downfall of the Litbel SSR as a union. With a peace treaty being signed with Lithuania after the Soviets seized the Belarusian capital Minsk, the Communist Party of Belarus and Lithuania decided to re-establish the Belarusian SSR. The Koidan Independent Republic was a partisan republic that was founded sometime in July of 1920 and only existed over a 4-day period. It came about when there was a neutral zone between the lines of Bolsheviks and the Polish during the Polish-Soviet War in Belarus. Though Poland did control the area before Koidan did briefly, but due to a lack of organization, they had left the area. Since Koidan was a neutral zone, the Bolsheviks tried to establish a revolutionary committee there, with limited success. The little power the Bolsheviks had in the area, they began to send Chekists into Koidan to root out any of the partisan activity that had been happening in the area. Though, before the arrival of the Chekists, the partisans caught wind they were coming into the area, so they went into hiding in the forest of Koidan. This resulted in the Revolutionary Committee arresting everyone in the village of Rudia. The partisans would send an ultimatum to the Revolutionary Committee explaining that if the people of Koidan are not freed, in 3 days problems will arise. The ultimatum was not taken seriously and rejected by the Revolutionary Committee. The partisans would end up attacking the village and arresting the Revolutionary Committee, freeing the ones who had been arrested. This would ultimately be a mistake, as Bolsheviks who were garrisoned in the nearby village of Samokhvalovchi would attack the village, which would eventually overwhelm the partisans and take Rudia and surround them in the nearby village of Dygilno. Remnants of the partisans would lead a counteroffensive that would end up failing, putting an end to the partisan republic. The Ukrainian state, or Second Hetmanate, was founded by the German Military Council on April 18, 1918, lasting to December 14, 1918. Germany saw rapid advancement through Russia during the final year of World War I. They established a few client states, one of them being the Ukrainian state. The Ukrainian state did have some footing during this time, as the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk did happen, though this wasn't without conflict, as another government vying for power known as the Ukrainian People's Republic, that was backed by the Whites, was suspected of kidnapping the chairman of the Foreign Trade Bank, Adam Dobry, in Kiev, though this would be adamantly denied by the competing government. The bank was where the Germans conducted all of their financial operations. During this time, on April 29th, Pavlo Skoropadsky would be elected by the 6,000 delegates from the Party Congress as the first and only hetman of the Ukrainian state. The same night, the hetman's supporters would attack the Central Council, which was the Ukrainian People's Republic building. While it was successful in the short term, it would eventually become a detriment to Pavlo, as Pavlo worked with the Central Powers to try and dispose of the UPR. This made him really unpopular with Ukrainians, with acts of sabotage taking place, as well as a combination of assassinations taking place on German officials, and the end of World War I, Pavlo would flee the country and the UPR would take full power of Ukraine. After the February Revolution happened in March 1917, the Ukrainian government in Kiev created a coalition of socialist political parties to run Ukraine, with Ukraine becoming an autonomous part of Russia. 10 months later, after the beginning of the Russian Civil War, the Ukrainian People's Republic proclaimed their independence, with Mikhail Hrushevsky becoming the first leader of an independent UPR. Ukraine at the time had already a lot of issues going for it, with an already ongoing civil war happening that predates the Russian Civil War by 8 months. The Ukrainian Civil War was initially the Soviets fighting the Russian Republic, but it then devolved into many countries and factions getting involved in Ukraine. On November 8, 1917, Bolsheviks in the city of Kiev started an uprising. With an already struggling Russian Republic, they did not have enough supplies to stop the uprising with World War I happening. The Bolsheviks in Kiev, along with the Central Council of Kiev, dispatched the Russian Republic soldiers fairly quickly, which the Bolsheviks and the Central Council proclaimed the Ukrainian People's Republic. Later, the Bolsheviks left the Central Council because they condemned the Petrograd uprising and were arrested 3 days later. November saw Bolsheviks have a successful uprising in Vinnytsia. A month later, on December 19th, Kharkiv was occupied by the Soviets. The Soviets then disarmed the UPR soldiers without any violence, due to them being heavily outnumbered. Shortly thereafter, the Ukrainian People's Socialist Republic was proclaimed, with Kharkov as the capital on December 25th. This would last up until April 19th, when UPR soldiers took it back with the help of Germans. January 29th saw the Battle of Krudy, where a small group of students and Cossacks numbering 600 strong took on a Bolshevik force of 6,000. All this battle served to do was to delay Bolsheviks from capturing Kiev. Roughly 300 of the 600 UPR soldiers were killed, whereas the Bolsheviks saw about the same amount of casualties. February 5th, 1918 saw 7,000 Bolsheviks arriving in Kiev. The UPR met them with 2,000 led by Mikhailo Kudvenko. The battle lasted 4 days, with Bolsheviks capturing Kiev on February 8, 1918. Though, less than a month later, Austro-Hungarian and German troops would retake Kiev. April saw a 15-day campaign through Crimea, with German and Ukrainian troops successfully ousting the Bolsheviks from the peninsula. On January 2, 1919, the largest offensive of the Ukrainian-Soviet War happened, and it started with an attack on Kharkov. With Germany surrendering and ending World War I, they had already pulled troops out of Ukraine, which meant that Ukraine would be an open target for the Bolsheviks, who had superior numbers up to that point. With Kharkov being captured, they next captured Cherniv on January 12, 1919, then captured Poltava on January 20th. January 29th also saw the UPR move their government to the city of Vinnytsia. By the end of January, the UPR forces were severely weakened by the offensive. The Bolsheviks were an ever-growing army, and their numbers played a role in most of the battles. By the end of January, the Ukrainian army only numbered 21,000. By this time, the Red Army numbered 200,000 men in Ukraine. With the February, a successful Bolshevik uprising in the city of Propyovsky, which was later joined by the Red Army. Early February also saw the capture of 2 more cities, Znamenica and Kryvyi. During this time, Kiev had been under siege for 2 weeks, starting on January 18, 1919. The fighting in Kiev had been the most brutal, with heavy casualties on both sides. Eventually, the UPR ended up breaking and being pushed out of Kiev on February 5, 1919. Though this was not the end of the UPR. March 1919 saw a counteroffensive by UPR forces. In April, UPR forces successfully captured the city of Separatist. By August 31, 1919, White Army forces captured Kiev, with no resistance, much to the ire of UPR forces. Though a small confrontation broke out between the White Army and the UPR forces, the order for UPR forces to pull out of Kiev was given. Then in December 1919, Kiev was recaptured by Bolshevik forces. December saw the beginning of a new Ukrainian offensive and saw the demobilization of UPR forces and the beginning of partisan warfare on the part of the UPR. This culminated in the UPR forces working themselves back up to Kiev for the final time. On April 20th, though this was short-lived, with retreating from Ukraine, the Soviets easily captured Kiev. This marked the 16th and final time Kiev had changed hands among different factions. This marked the end of Ukraine and the Russian Civil War. They still fought partisan warfare up until November 1921, which then marked the defeat of Ukraine in the Russian Civil War. West Ukrainian People's Republic declared their independence on November 1st, 1918. Koslevetsky then became president. The army that headed the WPR was the Ukrainian Galician Army, which was headed by Myron Tarnovsky. They had then later combined their forces with the Ukrainian People's Republic in the latter half of the Ukrainian-Soviet War. Their existence from the beginning was a struggle, with Poland attempting to seize oil fields on their border. This began the Polish-Ukrainian War. First battle took place on November 2nd, 1918 in the city of Przemysl, with Poland beating back West Ukrainian forces on November 10th. The previous day, West Ukrainian forces started a siege on the town of Lemberg up until May 22nd of 1919, which ended in Polish victory. They saw Romania invading and capturing Pokada, where it seems WPR forces did not put up much of a fight. The next offensive of the Polish-Ukrainian War was the Chortkiv offensive, which was a WPR offensive which caught the Polish off guard. This offensive took place on June 7, 1919, where the WPR did make quick gains in the following days until the 21st, where they started to get pushed back June 20th. The forces of WPR were pushed into UPR territory. A month later, on July 16, 1919, Polish forces had taken full control of the region, with the WPR becoming a government in exile up until 1923. After the Russian Revolution had begun, Bolsheviks in Kiev had an uprising. With this happening, the Bolsheviks had a split from each other not long after the uprising, causing the Bolsheviks to lose Kiev, with most of them fleeing to Kharkov. They later asked the Central Council in Ukraine to recognize the RSFSR, with the Central Council refusing to do so. From the beginning, it was a struggle for the Ukraine to get off the ground due to lack of funding from anybody, because the Central Powers refused to recognize it, instead going with the Ukrainian People's Republic. They did lose Kharkov with the German offensive happening. Shortly after, Germany surrendered and signed the armistice to end World War I. The Soviets were fully pushed out of Ukraine on November 24, 1918. Though 2 months later, in February of 1919, the Soviets did end up retaking Kharkov. This began another decline for them, with Lenin giving full administration control of Ukraine over to the Soviet government in Moscow. After being pushed back again in August of 1919, December of 1919 saw the Soviet-Ukrainian government being restated for the third and final time. With the UPR losing its Polish support, the Ukrainian SSR took Ukraine by November of 1921. For the Bolsheviks, and ended the Soviet-Ukrainian War, becoming an autonomous republic in the Soviet Union up until 1991. The Kholodnyar Republic, or sometimes referred to as the Cold Ravine Republic, was a partisan republic founded by Vasil Chuchupak, Ivan Derkach, Konstantin Pastushko, and Gerasim Nestorenko. The republic lasted from 1919 to 1922, located in the Kholodnyar Forest in Kiev province. Their territory consisted of 25 villages, and their army was 15,000 strong, consisting of peasants at their height. Kholodny Yark fought both the White and Red armies, which pretty much made them on borrowed time. With the UPR's offensive into Kherson, In March 1920, 12,000 UPR soldiers who were from the Steppe Division joined up with the Kladnyar Army, growing massively due to this. 1920 saw more skirmishes between White Army and the Bolsheviks, but 1921 saw the start of the fall of the Republic. During this time, Cheka, who was the first Soviet secret police, established a fake conglomerate of rebel groups called the Black Sea Rebel Group. They then convinced the leaders of Kladnyar of the Black Sea Rebel Group. The Cheka also intercepted a UPR general who was heading to Kladnyar and had him partisans away from the front line. Later in 1922, they then lured Kladnyar leaders into a trap and arrested them along with a lot of others. 1922 also saw the ones being arrested having a failed uprising in a Kiev prison. Makhno of Shishina was founded on November 27, 1918 by Nestor Makhno. Makhno of Shishina was an anarcho-communist commune. In early 1918, in the city of Heliopol, UPR officials started threatening the local anarchists with arrests. The anarchists then acted on these threats, killing a UPR official. This then brought local Ukrainian nationalists to the negotiation table with Nestor Makhno. April 15th saw UPR officials orchestrating a coup against the anarchists in Heliopol, with the UPR disarming the anarchists. A riot ensued with local anarchists protesting and rioting for the release of the anarchist officials, but before they could be released, Austro-Hungarian troops entered the city sometime in the spring of 1918. With the surrender of the Central Powers in November of 1918, the Soviet Union moved into Ukraine quickly. During this time, the Bolsheviks and Makhno of Shishina had a very rocky alliance with neither side not overly trusting of each other, with the anarchists weary of the centralization that the Bolsheviks followed. January 1919 saw the Battle of Donbass in a 4-month offensive that lasted until May 1919. The White Army broke through the lines of the Bolsheviks occupying the region, and the people in Makhno of Shishina were heavily suppressed, and partisan warfare took place by Makhnovists. Though by October 1919, Makhnovists had beaten back a struggling South Russia, by November, the South Russian army was pushed back to the eastern tip of Ukraine. December of 1919 saw a typhus epidemic growing through the region, with both the White Army and Black Army suffering due to the epidemic, with the White Army briefly taking back a part of East Ukraine. By the start of January 1920, the Red Army had captured the Makhnovist territory. The Soviet secret police, the Cheka, had a very large presence upon the Red Army occupation, as partisan warfare was a very large thing in the area. By May 1920, the Makhnovists decided to wage partisan warfare against the Bolsheviks, with some success capturing back some of their territory. June 6, 1920 saw a South Russian offensive into North Turadia, with Black Army forces providing 2,000 cavalry, being only a fraction of the 133,000 soldiers that the Bolsheviks provided. And the South Russians had 35 soldiers to initiate the offensive. This offensive had South Russians wanting to push into Ukraine, with the beginning of the offensive being initially successful for the Whites, capturing the cities of Melitopol and Oleksandrivsk. By the start of July 1920, the beginning of July saw the Whites capturing the city of Tokmak and leading an offensive on Mariupol, but eventually were pushed back. August 7, 1920 saw the beginning of the plan for an offensive on the town of Kakova, with Reds hoping to push back the Whites into Crimea. September 15th saw the Reds recapturing the city of Mariupol. September 26th saw 8,000 of Makhnov's forces meeting 15,000 of White Army forces in the city of Peregonovka. The Black Army forces had retreated 600 kilometers up to this point, taking enormous losses. Nestor Makhno gave a speech to his soldiers proclaiming that they would no longer be retreating. The right flank of the White Army, who were near the Latran River, was being severely weakened in Kherson due to the fighting with the Bolsheviks. The battle starting, the White Army heavily outnumbered the Black Army, with the White Army pushing the Makhnovists to the edge of the city. The Makhnovists then readjusted to the larger force and did a saber charge on the Whites, routing the Whites from the city. Nestor Makhno then forced a retreat, whittling them down to 100 of the 15,000 men they initially had. Though some White Army forces tried to help, they were all killed. November 7th, 1920 started the siege of Perekop, where Makhnovist had a detachment helping the Bolsheviks. The South Russians were defeated 10 days later. After the battle, the Bolsheviks purged the Makhnovist leadership, with many of their leaders being killed or arrested, with what was left of the leadership retreating back to Ukraine. Then a conflict ensued between Makhnovists and Bolsheviks. By mid-1921, the Black Army forces were dwindling with support in the region, moving towards the Bolsheviks, with the conflict ending in August 1921. Nestor Makhno eventually ended up fleeing Ukraine and spending the rest of his days in Paris, France. On December 13, 1917, the Crimean Kurultai, led by Noman Selisibyan, declared the independence of the Crimean People's Republic. The Crimean People's Republic is known as the very first Muslim democratic republic to exist. The Kurultai were in opposition to the Bolsheviks, the Kurultai being the Crimean People's Republic government body. It was only 3 days later, on December 16, 1917, when the Black Sea Fleet, which was predominantly controlled by the Bolsheviks, attacked and captured Sevastopol. The reason for the Bolsheviks doing this was not just for capturing the city, but also the Black Sea Fleet's headquarters were in Sevastopol. The rest of September was the Crimean People's Republic building up their army with local Crimeans, Russians, and Ukrainians. January 4th, 1918 saw the resignation of Noman Selisibyan. It was only 10 days after, on January 14th, he was then captured by the Bolsheviks in the city of Simferopol. He was then later executed in Sevastopol on February 23rd, 1918. January 10th, 1918 saw the Kurultai trying to negotiate with the Bolsheviks to stop the armed conflict, though by the end of January, all of Crimea had been captured by the Bolsheviks. April 13th, 1918 saw them being briefly re-established for 12 days, with the German and Ukrainian troops attacking the peninsula. The first days of the offensive for the Germans and Ukrainians was a rapid advance in the first week of the operation. A major uprising began with Crimean Tartars on April 18th, 1918, with the small villages of Kayakskfor and Kutlak, where they then defeated a small detachment of Black Sea Fleet sailors. April 20th saw Bolsheviks and Crimeans fighting each other in and around the city of Feodosia. The next day, on April 21st, the Crimeans captured 2 more villages. The uprising lasted up to April 27th. The Crimean regional government was a country that existed in 2 phases. The pro-German phase on June 25, 1918, and the more pro-Entente phase in November of 1918. They existed up until April 2, 1919. During the pro-German phase, it had been fairly uneventful for them, with the Germans pushing the White Army totally out of Crimea. The pro-Entente phase, they did achieve some kind of recognition from Ukraine. Crimea in November of 1918 came under the protection of the White Army. During this time, they had a very big threat to their north of anarchists and the Red Army. The Crimean regional government did not have much of an army, with the Whites' Wrangel's army, who was led by Pyotr Wrangel, being the main army for them. April of 1919 saw an offensive by Bolshevik troops moving into Crimea, bringing an end to the regional government. South Russia was formed on January 8, 1919, lasting up to November 22, 1920. South Russia was operated by Russian forces in the south and was led by Anton Denikin. Most of the fighting they were a part of was in Ukraine. The first of the fighting South Russia did was in January of 1919, when White and Red armies fought in the city of Voronezh in Voronezh Oblast. The Whites were defeated in the same month. As this was happening, the fighting in the Caucasus was happening, and the Reds were pushing heavy into the region and capturing major cities in the Caucasus. As the offensive started on December 18, 1918, and lasted up to March 1919, with the Bolsheviks being completely pushed out of the Caucasus. August 14, 1919 saw a counteroffensive, along with fighting in Kursk and Voronezh, with the South Russians defeating the Bolsheviks. Also, during this time, there was a spearhead towards Moscow by South Russian forces, which started on July 3, 1919, ending in failure on November 18, 1919. After this point, most of the fighting took place in the same areas of Kursk, Voronezh, and Orel. January 11th, 1920 saw fighting in Odessa, with the Bolsheviks defeating the Whites. January 17th, 1920 saw a new offensive into South Russia by the Bolsheviks, with the Bolsheviks moving back into the Caucasus with relative ease, with that coming to an end on April 7th, 1920. As the Bolsheviks were pushing the South Russians back, the South Russians had been pushing into Crimea, with their capital being moved from Ekaterinodar to Novorossiysk in March 1920, and then from Novorossiysk to Sevastopol in April of 1920. November 7th, 1920 was the beginning of the end for the South Russians, as they were pushed into Crimea and were subsequently defeated and dissolved on November 17th, 1920. The Kuban People's Republic was founded on January 28, 1918 and lasted up to March 17, 1920, being led by Alexander Filimonov from 1918 to 1920, and then Nikolai Upsensky in 1919, then finally Nikolai Bekretov in 1920. April 30th, 1917 saw the beginning of a meeting between local Cossacks. The meeting ended on May 3rd, 1917, with the Cossacks forming the Kuban Military Council, also known as the Rada, with them electing the council head Mikhailo Ryabovil. There was an immediate struggle for power in the region, with the large peasant population overwhelmingly siding with the Bolsheviks, which delayed the military council, as peasants dissolved it. Though months later, on February 16, 1918, the military council would be formed once again, and gain some favor among the populace. A month later, in March of 1918, the military council would form the Kuban People's Republic once again. The capital of Kuban People's Republic was Ekaterinodar, which is located near Crimea. During the initial stages of the Kuban People's Republic, it sought unification with the Ukrainian state, though this only isolated the Kuban People's Republic, as the Ukrainian state was a client state of the German Empire. This also isolated them from the Whites at the time, as the Russians were at war with the Germans. The KPR also claimed most of the Caucasus, with the exceptions being Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. December 1918 saw the Kuban People's Republic sending a delegation to the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. This was in a bid to get support for independence, as they broke away from their alliance with South Russia, and for the fight against Bolshevism. They did end up getting recognition from the Ukrainian People's Republic, Azerbaijan, the German Empire, the Ottoman Empire, Georgia, and the Democratic Republic of the Caucasus. Anton Denikin later learned about this breaking of the alliance and ordered the Rada to be surrounded. 10 Rada members were arrested. After South Russia fell in December 1919, the Rada re-established in early 1920, but it was short-lived due to the Bolsheviks having far superior numbers. The Mountainous Republic was founded on March 6, 1917 and lasted up to November 30th, 1922, being led by Tapa Chermov in 1918, then Pushmenko Kostev from 1919 on. In March of 1917, an executive committee was formed by local leaders to appoint a new leader, which they then appointed Tapa Chermov as such. The Mountain Republic did not declare independence until May of 1918, when it was proclaimed, with the capital initially being Terekil, which is modern-day Vladikavkaz, the capital of North Ossetia, Alania. Though the capital would be later relocated to Tamirkan-Shura, which is now Bayansk, due to the Bolsheviks occupying the city. The Mountainous Republic would find some international recognition from the British and others due to the Republic receiving support from Syed Shamil, who was the grandson of Imam Shamil, who was the leader of the Caucasian Emirate, which was a country that existed in the 1800s. In March 1919, the Mountain Republic also attended conferences for the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and the Treaty of Versailles. During these conferences, they sought independence. Their opposition to the Bolsheviks led the Bolsheviks to not recognize them as a legitimate country. After South Russia was defeated, it wasn't long after the Mountainous Republic would be defeated, as they heavily relied on South Russia. By January 1921, most of the region had been occupied by the Bolsheviks. By 1922, the Republic had been completely dissolved. The Transcaucasian Democratic Federative Republic was founded on April 22, 1918, and would be fully dissolved on May 28, 1918. The TDFR was led by Akai Chekhenkeli and Nikolai Chikadze. As the Russian Empire was collapsing in 1917, many parts of the Caucasus were looking for independence from the Russian Empire. Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia sought to unite into one country via an executive committee called the Special Transcaucasian Committee. The legislative body of the TDFR was the Sejm, and consisted of all the regional political parties of the aforementioned countries. During World War I, the Ottoman Empire led a campaign into the Caucasus. On April 14, 1918, the Ottomans besieged the city of Batum. The TDFR held the city until April 25th, which was enough time for the populace to evacuate the city. Back on April 22nd, the Ottomans had sent a delegation to negotiate peace with the TDFR, with the Georgian part of the TDFR leading the negotiations. During the negotiations, the Azerbaijanis, who were Muslims, had many disagreements and were hesitant to resume fighting with the Ottomans due to them being Muslim as well. The peace talks did halt the Ottomans briefly, but they would eventually resume. The next month in May, a Georgian politician in the Sejm named Ikreli Tsereteli blamed the Azerbaijanis for not helping stop the Ottomans advancing into their territory. This would cause the republic in the coming days that made up the TDFR to all declare their independence due to the infighting in the TDFR, bringing an end to the republic. The Democratic Republic of Georgia was founded on May 26, 1918, and would be annexed on February 25, 1921. Georgia would initially be led by No Ramashvili, who was a part of the Menshevik faction of the RSDLP, and would later be a key member of the Social Democratic Party of Georgia. He would later be succeeded by No Jordania, who was also Menshevik. No Jordania would be the leader of Georgia up until the defeat and exile of the Georgian government in 1921. The governing body of Georgia at the time was the Constituent Assembly of Georgia, in which the majority of seats would be held by the Social Democratic Party of Georgia during the entire time of their existence. Georgia being a client state of the German Empire, they would get immediate recognition from them, as well as the Ottoman Empire. Georgia's support from the German Empire helped them fight off invading Bolshevik forces, which would later affect them as the Germans lost in World War I. Bolsheviks were not the only issue for Georgia, as their relations with Armenia and Azerbaijan were very uneasy. December 7, 1918 saw Georgia going to war with Armenia over the regions of Borchelye and Arhalk-Alaki, which this conflict would last up to December 31st, 1918, when the British intervened due to the Bolshevik forces in the area, as the British sought to unite the anti-Bolshevik forces in the region. South Russia was also a problem in the region, and the British intervened so the South Russians would not annex the country. June 16, 1919 saw Georgians and Azerbaijanis creating a mutual defense pact due to the ongoing threats of the White and Red Armies. After South Russia fell in 1920, the ever-growing threat of annexation by the Bolsheviks grew even more. The Bolsheviks initially offered an alliance to Georgia and the neighboring countries, but this was outright refused, and Georgia claimed neutrality in the Russian Civil War, though Georgia was open to opening diplomatic relations with the Bolsheviks. As their neighbors were annexed, Georgia's situation became much more dire. During this time, on December 16, 1920, the League of Nations, the predecessor to the United Nations, held a vote to recognize the independence of Georgia, as well as for them to gain membership with the League of Nations. This vote would end up failing. On January 21, 1921, The Georgians did end up getting recognition from the League of Nations, though this did not save them from getting annexed by the Bolsheviks. The First Republic of Armenia was founded on May 28, 1918, and would be annexed on December 2, 1920. Armenia's first leader would be Hovhannes Kajazuni, who was a part of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, or the ARF, who were socialist revolutionaries. Hovhannes would lead from June 6, 1918 to May 28, 1919. His successor, Alexander Kastisian, would lead from May 28, 1919 to May 5, 1920. Alexander would be succeeded by Hamo Ohanjanyan. He would lead from May 5th to May 5th, 1920 to November 25th, 1920. And the last leader of Armenia would be Simon Vratsian, who would lead from November 25th, 1920 to December 2nd, 1920. The Armenian National Council would be the committee that headed the breakaway from the TDFR. They would be the ones who appointed Hovhannes Kajazuni. The governing body of Armenia at the time was the Korodaran and was mostly controlled by the ARF from the beginning. Due to Armenia's close proximity to the Ottoman Empire, it dealt with a lot of fighting against the Ottomans and the Azerbaijani governments. Muslims in Armenia were more aligned to the Azeri and Ottoman governments, as they were also Muslim. Ethnic uprisings, with the ethnic groups being Turkish, Azeri, and Kurdish peoples. The first of the fighting started on July 1st, 1919, when Azerbaijani rebels attacked a railway station in the town of Davalu, which is now modern-day Ararat. The Turkish and Kurdish uprisings would take place a month later on August 17th, 1919 in the village of Kagizman. During all of this, Azerbaijanis in the Ottoman government would be arming the rebels. Though by the next year, on July 28, 1920, the uprisings would be defeated. Back on March 30th, 1918, the Azerbaijani and Armenian populations were in a very uneasy situation, as ethnic tensions between the two would boil over and turn into a conflict. This would be known as the Armenia-Azerbaijani conflict. As both Azerbaijan and Armenia were under the Russian Empire's rule before World War I and the Russian Civil War, the ethnic tensions between the two would be heavily suppressed. Not only did this make it into a powder keg, as both Azerbaijanis and Armenians are known to not get along, but the Ottomans would also stoke the flames of this conflict during the Russian Civil War, as they were heavily involved in helping the Azerbaijanis. During this time, the Bolsheviks took advantage of the ethnic conflict and threw themselves into the mix. The conflict made it fairly easy for them to win battles and defeat the Armenians. This conflict would be the end of Armenia, as they were defeated by the Bolsheviks on November 28, 1920. Armenia would only last 4 more days before they were fully annexed by the Bolsheviks. The Azerbaijan Democratic Republic was founded on May 28, 1918, and was annexed on April 28, 1920. The first leader was Fatili Khan Koyosky, who led from May 28, 1918 to April 14, 1919. He had no political affiliation. His successor, Nasib Bey Yusuf Beyli, who came into power on May 28, 1919 and left power on March 30, 1920, he was affiliated with the Musavat, who had pan-Islamic and Turkish beliefs. Nasib is most known for establishing diplomatic relations with the Western world. The final leader of Azerbaijan was Muhammad Hajinsky, who led from March 30th, 1920 and was ousted by the Bolsheviks on April 20th, 1920. He was also affiliated with the Musavat. The Azerbaijan government was very close with the Ottomans, as the Ottomans were helping the Azeris in the Azerbaijan-Armenian War. Azerbaijan, like their neighbors, were struggling from the beginning, as they were in conflict with the Bolsheviks and the White Army. As well, like their neighbors, Azerbaijan sought neutrality during the Civil War, though this was to no avail. Woodrow Wilson, the U.S. president at the time, was notably cold to the plight of Azerbaijan, as Azerbaijan sent a delegation seeking recognition from the United States. As the Armenian-Azerbaijan War was ongoing, Bolsheviks had an uprising in the capital of Azerbaijan, Baku. Ottomans and Azeris arrived in the city 14,000 men strong to the opposing forces of 27,000 men. The fighting in Baku lasted from August 26, 1918 and ended in September 14, 1918, and resulted in the Ottoman and Azeri forces taking Baku. The battle established Baku as the capital of Azerbaijan, as the previous capital was Ganja, up until September of 1918. 1919 saw Jordan and Azeri governments forming a mutual defense pact. Though this would not be enough, because Bolsheviks started an offensive into Azerbaijan on April 27th, and by the next day, the Bolsheviks would be in Baku, and the government would be ousted into exile. The Baku Commune was founded on April 13, 1918, and would be couped and ousted on July 26, 1918. The Baku Commune wasn't led by a single central leader, but by 26 commissars. The Baku Commune came about when Bolsheviks and Armenian Revolutionary Federation members started to purge the Azerbaijani population in Baku. This resulted in 6,000 Bolsheviks and 4,000 Dashnaks, or ARF members, at the start of the battle, with the Musavat Party, who also had 10,000 men. Tensions between Bolsheviks and the Musavat Party were high, as disarming attempts by the Bolsheviks were attempted with success. During this time, Dashnak forces were pillaging the Muslim parts of Baku. The Musavat Party would be ousted from Baku by April 2nd of 1918, losing 7,500 men, whereas the Bolsheviks and Dashnaks only took 2,500 casualties. After the establishment of the Baku Commune on April 13, 1918, food shortages hit the city, which caused a rapid downfall, as much of their existence was conflict with the Azerbaijani government. Eventually, due to the threat of the Ottomans, allying groups of the Bolshevik-led Baku Commune, which consisted of the AFR, Socialist Revolutionaries, and Mensheviks, would be turned against the Commune by the British, as they felt they didn't stand much of a chance against the Ottoman Empire. July of 1918, the 26 commissars sought to escape Baku, as it was coming to an end, with most of the allies turned against them, and the active threat of the Ottomans. They tried to escape via ship to Astrakhan. They would end up being intercepted by the Caspian Fleet, who was controlled by the White Army at the time. All 26 commissars would be executed. Lithuania declared their independence from the Russian Empire on February 16, 1918, with the Council of Lithuania overseeing their independence, while they appointed Augustinas Voldemaras as their leader. When Germany lost World War I on November 11, 1918, Lithuania would form their first national government, with Augustinas as their leader. December 12, 1918 would see Lithuania's first of three major conflicts as a newly independent nation. The Bolsheviks, seeing Lithuania as an easy target, would invade Lithuania. The Soviets sent 20,000 men into Lithuania, where they would capture two-thirds of Lithuanian territory by January 25, 1919. February 10, 1919 saw Bolshevik forces surrounding the city of Kaunas, with the Bolsheviks having 1,000 troops surrounding the city, compared to the 200 Lithuanian troops in the city. February 22nd saw Weimar Germany sending volunteers into Lithuania because of the proximity of the Bolsheviks to East Prussia. By March 1919, the Lithuanians had completely stopped the Bolshevik offensive. Much of March and April was the Lithuanians prepping for a counteroffensive, for trying to break the ongoing stalemate between the Bolsheviks and themselves. March saw the Polish joining the fight, though it wouldn't be on the side of either the Bolsheviks or the Lithuanians. Poland did recognize Lithuania and was hoping to reform the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Lithuania would take advantage of the Polish joining and lead an offensive into Vilnius on April 3, 1919, with Lithuanians liberating Vilnius on April 8, 1919. Much of April and May saw the Bolsheviks being pushed back heavily by Polish and Lithuanian forces. By August, due to the Lithuanians being very worried about the Polish attacking them, fighting between the Lithuanians and the Bolsheviks had completely stopped. Peace talks between the Bolsheviks and the Lithuanians would be delayed until May of 1920, due to the Lithuanians worrying that negotiating with the isolated Bolshevik government would as well isolate themselves from the rest of Europe. The peace talks would conclude in June 1920. Though the Bolsheviks tried and failed to coup the Lithuanian government in a last-ditch attempt to overthrow the Lithuanian government. The next of the fighting happened in June of 1919, when Promotions, who were a mixture of Russian and German soldiers, attacked the town of Kursanai. The Promotions had taken a large chunk of western Lithuania by October 1919. October would also see the Lithuanians with a counteroffensive. By November, Lithuanians recaptured the city of Radvilski, along with capturing planes and cannons. By December 1919, the Promotions would be completely pushed out of Lithuania. May 1919 saw rising diplomatic tensions between Polish and Lithuanians, with them turning to war in August of 1919, with the Polish attempting to coup the Lithuanian government. Border skirmishes broke out between the Polish and Lithuanians over the regions of Slovakia and Vilnius. In September of 1919, Lithuanians during this time had to downsize its military from 40,000 to 25,000 men due to budget constraints. July 1920 became difficult for the Lithuanians as they were both dealing with the Bolsheviks and the Polish. Due to this, the Polish pushed into Lithuania, though Lithuania claimed neutrality, and eventually it was found out by the Polish that Lithuania was allowing Bolshevik troops to move through their territory. By September 1920, the Polish and Lithuanian governments found peace. Though by the next month in October of 1919, the fighting would resume in the region of Vilnius, though this would be short-lived as the Lithuanians and Polish would find peace in November. November 18th, 1918, Latvia proclaimed their independence with Jānis Katskis as the first president of Latvia. The People's Council of Latvia were the ones who oversaw the independence of Latvia. December 1st, 1918 saw the beginning of the Latvian War of Independence. As the Latvians declared independence, their situation outside their border had gotten worse. The Bolsheviks saw the Baltic states as an easy target. The Soviet troops, aided by Red Latvian riflemen, would capture the town of Aluski on December 7th, due to Latvia not being able to raise a sizable army in the time of their independence. The rest of December saw the Bolsheviks capturing small and medium-sized towns. January 3rd, 1919, Bolshevik forces captured the capital of Latvia, Riga. By January 15th, 1919, the Soviet offensive into Latvia had been stopped by Latvian forces, with the Latvians partaking in a small counteroffensive, retaking the town of Skrunja. After this counteroffensive, the Soviets had stopped all offensive operations into Latvia. Bolsheviks weren't the only problem for Latvia, as they were also fighting German nobility. They were initially allied with the German nobility, but ethnic tensions between Latvian and Germans boiled over on June 19, 1919, with Baltic Landswehr and Freikorps soldiers attacking the town of Cesis, with them initially taking the town, but with the help of Estonians, the Latvians would push the German soldiers out of the town. June also saw them attacking the town of Straup, with them again initially taking it, but were pushed out of the town once again. By July, the Landswehr would sign an armistice that was mediated by the British and combined into the Latvian army. Though, the Freikorps would not follow the armistice and continue fighting, joining up with the Promotions, though this would be short-lived as Latvia had the help of France, Britain, and Estonia. The Promotions would swiftly be defeated. January 1920 saw a Polish-Latvian offensive into occupied Bolshevik territories. By the end of the month, a truce would be had between Latvian and Soviet governments that was unbeknownst to the Polish. By April 1920, a peace treaty would be signed between Latvia and the Soviet Union. Estonia would declare their independence on February 24, 1918, being initially led by Johann Laidoner, who was formerly in the Russian military. The Bolsheviks, as stated before, would attack the three Baltic countries, with them attacking Estonia on November 28, 1918, with the first battle being Narva. The Bolsheviks had attacked the town 6 days earlier, with them being repelled. The Germans who remained in Estonia were helping the Estonians, and blew bridges leading to Narva. The fighting in and around the towns of Kelteri and Joala would take place, but these would be repelled by German and Estonian forces. Bolshevik naval forces would help back up the ground forces attacking Narva. The Bolsheviks would take the town the same day the battle started, along with the town of Yalin on November 29th, 1918. January 8th, 1919 saw the Battle of Tapa. As Bolsheviks pushed into Estonia, the Estonians planned a counteroffensive. The Tapa part of the counteroffensive had 448 men in 3 armored trains. In the early morning of January 8th, Estonian soldiers were traveling to Tapas in an armored train that would take fire from Bolshevik troops. Estonia would capture Tapas the next day. The Estonians would have 4 people wounded, while the Bolshevik would lose 100 men and have another 7 wounded. The Battle of Utria would take place on January 17th and would end on January 20th, 1919. The battle would include Finnish volunteers and the Estonian Navy, alongside the Estonian Army. The Estonian Navy would help land the Estonian and Finnish forces, where they would successfully take the town of Utria, along with Narva. The Bolsheviks lost 300 men, and the Estonians would only take 32 losses. January 13th through 14th would see the Battle of Tartu. The Estonians, with the help of Danish volunteers, would attack the town successfully, taking it from the Bolsheviks. January 18th, 1919 would see 220 Estonians attacking the town of Lagna, successfully taking the town. January 31st, 1919 would see the Battle of Paju. The Estonians, with the help of Finnish volunteer group Sons of the North, defeated the Bolsheviks fairly handily, taking the town on the same day. The final battle of the Estonian War of Independence would take place on November 18th and end on December 30th, 1919, in the town of Krivisu. Estonians and Bolsheviks would find peace on February 2nd, 1920. The Kingdom of Finland declared their independence on December 6, 1917, and would be turned into a republic on July 17, 1919. Frederick Charles would be the king for the time of the kingdom's existence. When Finland declared their independence from the Russian Empire, Finland would become a client state of Germany, hence why they were a kingdom. It would only be a month later, in January of 1918, when violent clashes between the Bolsheviks and Finland would escalate into a full-blown civil war. January 27, 1918 would see Finnish Bolsheviks defending the village of Kamara from Finnish forces. The fighting would break out at the local train station, with the Bolsheviks successfully defending the train station from the Finns. This allowed the Finnish Bolsheviks to supply themselves. January 31st to March 18, 1918 saw the Battle of Vipulia. It saw 1,500 Bolsheviks attacking the town, while it was defended by 1,000 Finnish troops. The Finnish would successfully defend the town. February 3rd, 1918 would see the city of Oulu being attacked by Russian and Finnish Bolsheviks, with 1,200 Finnish troops defending the city. The battle would only last a day, with the Finnish only taking 33 casualties, where the Bolsheviks lost 1,527 of the 1,800 men they had. February 5th, 1918 would see the Battle of Rivosi. Though previously the Finnish Bolsheviks and the Finnish in Rivosi made an agreement on January 27th not to fight each other, this would break on February 5th. The fighting would start when the Finnish Bolsheviks would cross the frozen lake Pavlosi, located near the town. Once the Bolsheviks crossed the lake, they would assault the Finnish positions in the town. The Finnish would temporarily break, but would come back with a counteroffensive on March 15th, pushing the Bolsheviks out of the town. The Battle of Torino would take place on February 6th, with 278 Finnish and 175 Swedish who were part of the Finnish army being the invading force. The battle would only last an hour and 30 minutes, with the Finnish and Russian Bolsheviks surrendering. February 11th through April 25th, 1918 saw the Battle of Antria. The Finnish troops would hold the town, but the fighting would be bogged down and be turned into trench warfare. Lots of the fighting would take place around the railways in the area. Eventually, by April 23rd, the Bolsheviks would be completely pushed out of the area. Åland would see some fighting during this time, with it beginning on February 10th, with Finnish troops landing on the island. The Swedish would land on the island 3 days later. There would be intermittent fighting between the Bolsheviks, Germans, Finnish, and Swedish, with the Swedish retreating from the island in May, and the Germans retreating September, with the Finnish eventually capturing the island. February 19th through February 21st would see the Battle of Varkas. The Finnish Bolsheviks would attack the Finnish, who were already anticipating a Bolshevik attack, putting up a strong defense, repelling the Bolsheviks. The Battle of Ratu started on February 21st, with the Bolsheviks defending the Ratu railway station from the White forces. Initially, the station would be defended by 100 Bolsheviks. Eventually, both forces would grow over 2,000 men, with the fighting moving to outside the railway station. The fighting would last up to April 5th, with the Whites defeating the Bolsheviks decisively, with the Bolsheviks taking 1,000 casualties, with the Finnish taking 270. March 15th through April 6th would see 16,000 Finnish troops and 400 Swedish troops under the Finnish army would see them attacking the city of Tampere. The Finnish Bolsheviks would defend the town with 14,000 men. The Finnish Bolsheviks would decisively lose the battle, losing 2,000 men, with another 11,000 being imprisoned. The Finnish would only lose 820 men. March 16th would see the Battle of Länki-Pohja, with the Finnish launching a major offensive into the town, taking it in a day. March 23rd would see Finnish troops and Swedish troops, a part of the Finnish army, attacking and capturing the town of Lempäälä. The Bolsheviks would launch a counteroffensive, but this would be repelled. April 10th would see German and Finnish troops attacking the town of Äänekoski, where fighting would be bogged down for the time being. April 12th to April 13th would see German and Finnish troops attacking the capital city, Helsinki. The Finnish Bolsheviks would lose 400 men and be decisively defeated in the city. April 19th to April 21st would see the Finnish Bolsheviks being defeated in the town of Hyvinkää. April 9th through May 1st would see the Finnish Bolsheviks being defeated in the town of Lahti by German and Finnish forces. The Battle of Viipuri would see 18,500 Finnish troops attacking the city on April 24th, with them capturing the city on April 29th. April 28th through 29th would see heavily outnumbered German troops being attacked by 5,000 Finnish Bolsheviks in the town of Serjantaka. The Bolsheviks would take the town. The final battles would take place in Äänekoski, with the Germans and Finnish troops fully defeating the Bolsheviks and pushing them out of Finland. The Republic of Utua was founded on June 21, 1918, and dissolved on December 10, 1920. The head of Utua would be S. Tikhonov, and was appointed by the provisional government. Utua would be formed by Finnish soldiers who were occupying the area. Bolsheviks would declare most peasants in the area as kulaks, so most peasants in the area would take up arms against the Bolsheviks. The lot of these peasants would form the pro-Karelia paramilitary group, the Forest Guerrillas, which would be made up of 3,000 people, and would be led by Uki Vainomainen. March 21st, 1918, would see Bolsheviks and British soldiers from the Murmansk Legion and the Karelian National Regiment trying to stop a Finnish offensive into Karelia, as they were trying to prevent the Germans from getting sea access, as Finland was a German client state. When Finnish soldiers had arrived in the region, they realized much of the Karelians in the region sought for some kind of self-governance. Bolsheviks and British attacks into the area were unsuccessful in their own right, with the Finnish using a village-hopping strategy. The conflict would lead to the formation of the Republic of Utua. It wouldn't be until October 1920, due to the Finns failing to convince Russia of the claims they had on Karelia, that Karelia would not have Finnish influence on them, and they would achieve self-governance they wanted. Though this wouldn't last long, as they would combine into another government. The Last Order was founded in December of 1917 and was annexed on August 17, 1920. As for the Kazakh people, the majority of people under the Last Order banner were also under the Russian Empire for almost a century. The Kazakh and Kyrgyz people would refuse conscription into the Russian army at the beginning and throughout World War I. This all culminated in an uprising of Kazakh and Kyrgyz people in an uprising in Central Asia on February of 1917. It wouldn't be until December 5th, 1917 that the Last Order would be proclaimed at the second All-Kazakh Congress in Orenburg. They would name Alikan Bukhaikhanov as the Prime Minister of the Last Order. The fighting would begin in 1918 in Rubskov, where the Alash forces would defeat the Bolsheviks. The next of the fighting would take place in Gorilovka, where the Alash forces would again decisively defeat the Bolsheviks. The beginning of a new offensive would start on June 28, 1918, known as the Separatist Front. This offensive would end in October of 1919. July 20th through July 21st would see the Alash Ordan forces and the White Army besieging the city of Sergiyopol, where the Bolsheviks would be heavily outnumbered, facing defeat the next day. The Battle of Kizil Agash would take place on October 7th, 1918. 300 Alash Ordans would attack Bolsheviks near the town. The Alash Ordans would take the nearby town, Saratovka, defeating the Bolsheviks handily there, which they would be driven out by the Bolsheviks from the town, then retake it on the same day. It would also be on the same day they would take the town of Kizil Agash. April 1919 would see a Bolshevik uprising in the village of Marignovka, though by May the uprising would be suppressed. April 1919 would see the Alash militia defeating Bolshevik forces in Turgay. 1919 would also see the Battle of Uralsk, with the Alash Ordans winning. November 2nd, 1919 would see the Bolshevik offensive known as the Ural-Guriev operations, the Bolsheviks defeating the Alash Ordans with the offensive on January 10th, 1920. Past this point, the government of the Alash Ordans would be dismantled, and they would spend till August fighting as partisans before they would fully be defeated. The Emirate of Bukhara would be founded in 1785 and would become a Russian protectorate in 1873. The leader of Bukhara at the time of the Russian Civil War would be Mir Muhammad Alim Khan. 1917 would see the start of the Bukharan Revolution. The Bolsheviks would have the help of the young Bukharans, who were a pro-Bolshevik group seeking to oust the emir from power. April 1917 would see the young Bukharans organizing protests against the reforms from Emir Muhammad. 6,500 people would show up to the protest that was located in front of the emir's palace. The emir would respond with 7,000 to 8,000 of his own supporters, along with troops. The young Bukharans, fearing that things would get out of hand, would withdraw their supporters from the front of the palace. On the same day, many protesters would be detained for taking part, though they would later be released from custody. After this protest, the young Bukharans would reorganize and gain new funding from a local millionaire. 1918 would see the Bolsheviks getting involved in an attempt to overthrow the Bukharan government. This would fail, and the Bolsheviks would sign a peace treaty with Bukhara for the time being. September 1918 would see the young Bukharans form the Bukharan Communist Party. 1919 would see much political instability in Bukhara as the Emir Muhammad became increasingly less popular among the people. During this time, the Emir would announce his support for the Basmachi movement. August 28, 1920 would see the Bolsheviks along with the young Bukharans launching a revolt in the city of Turkmenabad, with it being successful. August 30th would see the Bolsheviks shelling the city of Bukhara, with the Bolsheviks and the young Bukharans launching an assault on September 2nd, 1920, ousting the emir from power. The Russian Provisional Government is what immediately came after the Tsar's abdication of his throne on March 15, 1917. Grigory Lov would be the first appointed chairman of the Provisional Government. He led up until July. Then he would be succeeded by Alexander Kerensky. They would be in direct opposition to the Petrograd Soviet. March 22, 1917 would see the United States recognizing the Provisional Government. Then 2 days later, on March 24, 1917, the UK, France, and Italy would recognize them. April would see Bolshevik-led protests in 1917. Grigory Lov would avoid violence with them at all costs, despite a plea from General Larv Krolonov to use force to suppress the protests. June would see a German Austro-Hungarian offensive into Russia. The Russians' military would break and lots of internal fighting in the provisional government would happen. July would see the Lov government falling apart and handing over the government to Alexander Kerensky. Grigory Lov would leave Russia for France. July would see violence between the Bolsheviks and the provisional government, with the pro-Bolshevik supporters breaking into the presidential palace. They would draw their arms on Kerensky, demanding he hands over power to the Bolsheviks. Riots had been breaking out in Petrograd, with the Kerensky government shooting down protesters. September 10th through 13th would see the Russian military under Larv Kronilov attempt a coup to overthrow the Petrograd Soviet, as well as the provisional government. This coup was done in part in an attempt to restore peace in the city. The provisional government would create the Committee of Struggle against the Counter-Revolution that would have Petrograd Soviets in it, representatives in it. The coup was not successful. After the coup, Kronilov would be arrested and imprisoned along with 30 different officers who were suspected of or were involved in the coup. He would later escape and lead the Dawn Army. September 14, 1917, the provisional government declared themselves as a republic. The Russian state would form from 3 provisional governments, 1 constituent assembly, and 1 administration, be proclaimed on September 23, 1918, and would coup the governments mentioned before to combine the White Armies on November 18, 1918. Alexander Kolchak would be declared the supreme ruler of Russia. November 29, 1918 would see the Siberian army under the Russian state leading an offensive into the Ural mountain range. The fighting would get bogged down in the mountains. The fighting would last up to January 29, 1919 with no clear winner in the offensive. March 4, 1919 would see a new offensive into the region, with the Russian state making some progress through the region, with the help of the Elash Ordens. While the fighting did make it into the Volga region, it would be stopped by a counteroffensive by the Bolsheviks. The counteroffensive would start on April 28, 1919 in Samara, with the Bolsheviks capturing Bugolama and Bugoruslan on May 13, 1919. The next part of their offensive was in Belivivsky district, with the Bolsheviks capturing the district on May 15, 1919. The Staropulu-Votkinsk operation would take place with the Bolsheviks attacking and taking the Staropulsky district on June 12, 1919. May 25th would also see the Ufa operation, with the Bolsheviks taking the province on June 20th, 1919. June 20, 1919 would also see the Second Perm operation, with the Bolsheviks fully occupying the region on July 1st, 1919. The Saltust operation would see the Bolsheviks attempting to encircle the remaining White Army soldiers in the region. The city of Yekaterinburg would be attacked and occupied by the Bolsheviks on July 20th, 1919. Chelyabinsk on July 17th would be attacked by 32,000 Bolsheviks, with 27,500 White Army soldiers defending the city. The Bolsheviks would take the city on August 4th, 1919. August 31st would see White Army members destroying the headquarters of the Turkestan Front, which was a military strategy organization. The Tobolsk operation would be the last offensive for the White Army. The operation would take place on September 1st and end in success on October 2nd. The Whites would push the Bolsheviks 200 kilometers back from where they were. The Petropavlovsk operation would start on August 20th and end on November 3rd, 1919. The Whites would lose 50% of their force in this operation. The Ural-Guriev operation would start on November 2nd and end on January 10th, 1920, with the entire Ural region being occupied by the Bolsheviks. November 14th, 1919 would see the start of the Great Siberian Ice Campaign, where the campaign would be located in Transbaikal. The capital of the Russian state, Omsk, is where the first battle would take place. Though the fighting for Omsk would initially start on November 14th, the battle for Omsk would last for 12 days, with the Whites being defeated. November 20th, 1919 would see the Novon Nikolaev operation. The Whites only numbered 12,600 men defending the town of Novo-Nikolaevsk from 35,800 Bolsheviks. The Whites would hold the town until December 16th, 1919, before being defeated. The final battle in the Great Siberian Campaign would be the Krasnoyarsk operation. The battle would start on December 18th, 1919 and would end on January 7th, 1920. This would bring an end to the Russian state. Though there were White Army elements left in Siberia, they would have nowhere near the strength of the Russian state. The Great Mongolian State would be founded on December 29th, 1911, after the Xinhai Revolution. 1912 through 1915 would see the Mongolians fighting with the Republic of China, though the Russians would mediate peace talks in 1915. The Great Mongolian State would be occupied by the Republic of China and as well be an autonomous region of the Republic of China after the Treaty of Kyoto. Though Mongolians argued for de facto independence during the negotiations. This was ultimately shut down. The Mongolians would view this treaty as very unfavorable to them, as this treaty would not recognize an independent Mongolia. As the Russians were a part of the treaty, when the Russian Civil War happened, the treaty would be seen as void. In 1918, the Mongolians, hearing rumors of an invasion from the Bolsheviks, would request the Chinese for military assistance, but when the invasion didn't happen, the Chinese would refuse to return their soldiers. Mongolia would be annexed by the Republic of China, who had the assistance of the White Movement in October of 1919, though the Mongolians would begin fighting with the Chinese once again for their independence. Starting in 1919, after the annexation, with the help of the White Movement, they would begin an offensive to retake their country. 1920 would see the Mongolians recapturing the city of Urga, routing the Chinese from the city. This conflict with the Chinese, along with the Russian Civil War, would also cause the rise of the Mongolian People's Party, with them forming from several different big resistance groups on June 25th, 1920. Their armed wing was called the Mongolian People's Army. The Mongolian People's Army, under the command of Damdin Sukbatar, would capture the city of Kyoto from the Chinese forces. October 1920 would see Russian cavalry units under General Roman von Eugen-Sternberg, who was a general for the Bod Khanate, would attack remaining Chinese troops, pushing them out of Mongolia. Sternberg would seize complete power in the Bod Khanate, giving Bod Khan de jure power. May 1921 would see a Bolshevik offensive into Mongolia. Sternberg would initially start attacking nearby Bolshevik states, but the Bolsheviks would respond with their own offensive. June 11th would see the Bolsheviks and Mongolian People's Army capturing Urga, the capital of Mongolia. The infighting, due to the White Army elements in the Bod Khanate wanting to invade Manchuria, would cause an insurrection within the Bod Khan's army. This would cause an immediate collapse in their forces. By August, Sternberg would be captured, and the Bod Khanate would be occupied by the Bolsheviks and the MPA, up until 1924, when the Mongolian People's Republic would be proclaimed. The Far Eastern Republic would serve as a buffer state for the from April 6, 1920, and would last up to November 15, 1922, when it would be absorbed into the Soviet Union. The Far Eastern Republic's capital would initially be Verkhnudinsk, then would be moved to Chita from October 1920 on. The Far Eastern Republic's president would initially be Alexander Krasnoshchikov from April 6, 1920 to December 1921, and Nikolai Matveyev would be his successor, and the final leader from December 1921 up till the dissolution of the Republic on November 15, 1922. April 5, 1920 would see the Far Eastern Republic fighting the White Movement in the Chita operation. The Far Eastern Republic would have a total of 17,600 soldiers, 107 machine guns, 31 artillery guns, 4 armored trains, and 4 tanks. The Whites would bring 14,600 men, 369 machine guns, 100 artillery pieces, and 18 armored trains. The fighting would start on April 5, 1920, with the Whites starting a simultaneous offensive on the town of Surentensk, Nerchensk, and Olavyana. April 10th would be the official start of the Chita offensive, with the Far Eastern Republic launching a counteroffensive on the Whites, where they would seize the towns of Beklamishvev, April 12, 1920 would see the whites encircling the FER troops in the town of Kopan. The FER would break out of this encirclement. April 20th would see the FER combining their fronts for their offensive into Transbaikal. April 25th would see the whites pushing back the FER from Transbaikal. May 10th, the FER would reorganize their force of 30,000 men. May 24th, the FER would initiate a ceasefire with Japan, who was also involved in the fighting. The entire month of October would be a new offensive into Transbaikal, with the Japanese evacuating the area, and their eventual stopping of fighting in the Russian Civil War to the detriment of the white movement. And by November, the FER would stamp the white movement out in Siberia. This is every country, republic, autonomous republic, kingdom, duchy, etc. that there wasn't enough to say about. The Galician Soviet Socialist Republic would form on July 15th, 1920, after a successful offensive by the Bolsheviks into Poland. Their chairman would be Vladimir Zentonski. The Galician SSR would be annexed on September 21st, 1920 by the Polish. The Kingdom of Poland was an Austro-Hungarian puppet state that would be established on January 14th, 1917. The Kingdom of Poland never had a king, but it had 5 different prime ministers between 1917 and 1918. After the armistice on November 11th, 1918, Poland would become an independent country because Austria-Hungary would be dissolved. The Republic of Zakopane would be founded on October 13th, 1918, and would be founded in the city of Zakopane by Stefan Czermonski. It would then join Poland on November 16th, 1918. The Republic of Tarnobrzeg would be founded on November 6, 1918. It would be annexed by Poland sometime in the spring of 1919. The Republic came about when peasants in the town of Tarnobrzeg would revolt and install Catholic priest Eugenius Okan, and who became the first president of the Republic. Then his successor would be Tomasz Dybal, who would lead up until the end when Poland would suppress the uprising. On January 17, 1918, Bolsheviks in the Kherson and Bessarabia regions declared the Odessa Soviet Republic, which was headed by the first and only chairman of the Republic, Vladimir Yudovsky. In February of 1918, Romanian troops attacked the Odessa Soviet Republic, but the attack was repulsed by the OSR, who only had 2,500 soldiers. The OSR only lasted up until March of 1918, when Austro-Hungarian troops rolled through and captured the region. The government of South Russia is remnants of South Russia's government. After it was pushed into Crimea, it would be led by one person, and that would be Pyotr Wrangel. It was established on April 4th, 1920, and annexed by the Bolsheviks on November 17th, 1920. The Taradia SSR saw the republic established on March 19, 1918, and lasted up until April 30th, 1918, with Jan Miller as their head of state, and Anton Slutsky as their head of government. Taradia was the Bolshevik successor to the Crimean People's Republic. Taradia's entire existence was in conflict with Germans and Ukrainians, conducting what is now known as the Crimean Operation. The fighting on the Bolshevik side did not go well, with the Taradian Bolsheviks being very unorganized, with both of their leaders being killed during the Crimean Operation. The Crimean Socialist Soviet Republic was established in May of 1919 and came to an end in June of 1919, being led by Dmitry Ulyanov, who was the brother of Vladimir Lenin. The Crimean SSR would be later annexed by South Russia after they evacuated the peninsula due to the size of South Russia. February 12, 1918 saw the formation of the Donetsk-Kryvyi Rog Soviet that was led by local Bolsheviks with Fyodor Sergeyev as the chairman. It was not recognized by the Bolshevik Central Committee. With the Germans moving into eastern Ukraine, their capital of Kharkov had been captured. Though there was stiff resistance put up to the occupation, the DKSR could not keep their borders and were occupied by Central Powers. The Hutzal Republic was founded on January 8, 1919 and lasted 6 months. The Hutzal Republic came about when the local population in Rakov rose up and fought the Hungarian forces, taking many of the garrison Hungarian troops in Rakiv prisoner. Stefan Klocharak was then elected prime minister. January 17th saw Hutzal troops under the command of Klocharak attacking the town of Sigetu Marmatil, which then destroyed their army, with 40% of their army being captured. After pretty much running on life support for the remainder of their existence, the death blow to the Hutzal Republic happened in June of 1919, with Hungarian troops invading and occupying the region. The Lemko Republic was founded on December 5, 1918 by Yaroslav Kaczmarczyk. The Lemko people would be divided among different factions in the Russian Civil War. People in the western part were pro-Russia, while the eastern part were pro-Ukrainian. It would be annexed by Poland in March 1920. The Komanska Republic, also known as the Eastern Lemko Republic, would be the pro-Ukraine part of Lemko, who was in opposition to the Lemko-Rusin People's Republic. It was founded on November 4, 1918, and was annexed by Poland on January 24, 1919. Peteliny Mon Shipka would be the leader of Komanska. Their initial plan was to unite with the West Ukrainian People's Republic, but this never happened. The Moldavian Democratic Republic was established on December 15, 1917 by Ion Inculet, with their independence being proclaimed on February 6, 1918, and was united with Romania on April 9, 1918. Ion Inculet would be the leader for the entire time. When the Moldavian Democratic Republic was established in late 1917, it was an autonomous republic of the Russian Empire. This wouldn't last long, as the White Army's grip on the region would slip. So on February 6, 1918, the Moldavian Republic would proclaim their independence. With a large threat of the Bolsheviks in the region, as the Bolsheviks had already captured a few cities in Moldavia, the Moldavian government sought the help of Romania. The Romanians brought that help that was needed to Moldavia, as they had a far superior army to the Bolsheviks in the region. April 9, 1918 saw the Moldavian government voting to unite with Romania, officially dissolving the republic. The Don Republic was founded on May 18, 1918 and was dissolved sometime in 1920. The Don Republic was a Cossack host that was formed by the armed forces of South Russia, being led by Pyotr Krasnov from 1918 to 1919, then by African Bogevsky from 1919 to 1921. The Atman, which is a Cossack leadership title, is who led the republic. The Don Republic was formed in direct opposition to the Don Soviet Republic. It would later be annexed by the Bolsheviks in 1921. The Don Soviet Republic was the direct competitor to the Don Republic. They claimed all the same territory of the Don Republic. The Don Soviet Republic was founded on March 23, 1918 and came to an end on May 8, 1918 as it was annexed by Don Cossack. The Terek Soviet Republic lasted from March 1918 to February 1919. Their capital initially was Pyatigorsk, then it was moved to Vladikavkaz. It would be annexed by South Russia in February of 1919. The Kuban Black Sea Soviet Republic lasted from May 30th, 1918 to July 6, 1918, and was merged into the North Caucasian Soviet Republic. Their capital was Ekaterinodar, and their leader was Avrin Rubin. The Stavropol Soviet Republic lasted from January 1st, 1918 to July 7th, 1918. The Stavropol Soviet Republic came to an end because it was combined with the North Caucasian Soviet Republic. The North Caucasian Soviet Republic was founded on July 7th, 1918, and was annexed by South Russia in December of 1918. The Republic of Mountainous Armenia was founded on April 26, 1921, and would be dissolved on July 13, 1921. There are only two leaders in their short existence, with Dragan Nizheded, who was a military commander in the First Republic, and Simon Varatsian, who was the head of the First Republic. Mountainous Armenia was remnants of the First Republic of Armenia's government, after they had been defeated by the Bolsheviks. Mountainous Armenia came about when remnants of the Armenian government had an uprising in the now Bolshevik-controlled Armenia. Most of it would be crushed, with 1,000 Armenian officials being arrested. Though, the Armenians did manage to take two provinces, Vyatzor and Sunyek. They also took some parts of Artsakh as well. Though, this would be short-lived as the Soviets had far superior numbers to the Armenians, and on July 13, 1921, the Bolsheviks would annex Mountainous Armenia. The Central Caspian Dictatorship was what immediately came after the Baku Commune. The Central Caspian Dictatorship was founded on July 26, 1918 by the Socialist Revolutionary Party and Menshevik groups, and lasted until September 15, 1918, with Azerbaijan and Armenian forces annexing the city. The Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic was the government that was installed after the First Armenian Republic was annexed. It lasted up to when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. After Azerbaijan fell, a pro-Bolshevik government would be installed, and it would later be turned into an autonomous republic in 1922. Same deal was the Bolshevik government that was instilled when the Democratic Republic of Georgia fell. The Republic of Aras was formed due to the ethnic tensions between the Armenians and Azerbaijanis. The Republic of Aras was initially a part of Armenia, but it was a majority Azeri. It's what initially caused the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia. It was founded in December of 1918 by Jafargulu Nakhchivansky and was dissolved in June of 1919 when the Soviets gave the area to Azerbaijan. The North Caucasian Emirate was founded by Uzun Haji Saltinsky, who became Emir in September of 1919. March 1920 would see the Emirate being annexed by the Bolsheviks. After the annexation of the Mountainous Republic and the North Caucasian Emirate, the MASSR would be formed by the Bolsheviks on January 20th, 1921, and would be broken up on July 7th, 1924. The PMDM was a British-controlled state that lasted from August 1st, 1918 and would be annexed on April 25th, 1919. It supported the idea of a single and united Russia. It would be couped by the Bolsheviks successfully. The Mugan Soviet Republic was formed by Bolsheviks in southeastern Azerbaijan on May 15th, 1919 and was annexed by Azerbaijan on June 2nd, 1919. The Southwestern Caucasus was established on December 1st, 1918 and lasted up to April 19th, 1919. The Southwestern Caucasus Republic's leader was Sihan Gurzaid Ibrahim Bey, who was elected by the Muslim National Committee, who was the committee that oversaw the independence of the republic. The British attempted to get an Armenian into the Kars, which was the governing body for the Southwestern Caucasus. In April of 1919, fighting between the Southwestern Caucasus and Georgia and Armenia broke out. Georgia and Armenia had the aid of the British, and by April 19, 1919, the British had dissolved the country. The Republic of Central Lithuania was a pro-Polish puppet state that was founded on October 12, 1920, and was incorporated into Poland on April 18, 1922. Józef Pilsudski wanted to reform the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and Central Lithuania was essentially building blocks for a Duchy of Lithuania that would be within a hypothetical new Poland-Lithuania. The appointed leader of Central Lithuania was Lucjan Zygulski. Lucjan was a general in the Russian Empire, and before he was the Central Lithuanian leader, he was a general in Poland during the Polish-Soviet War. Lucjan was from a Polish and Lithuanian background. During the peace talks that were mediated by the League of Nations, as well as these peace talks taking place in Brussels, Belgium, for the Polish-Lithuanian War, part of the stipulations made was that Central Lithuania would be incorporated into Lithuania, though this idea would be rejected by the Polish. The Polish wanted a plebiscite that was Central Lithuania, though this idea would eventually fall by the wayside. These peace talks would go nowhere. After peace was eventually negotiated for the Polish-Lithuanian War, Central Lithuania in April of 1922 would vote in the Sejm, their parliament, to incorporate into Poland, which they would eventually overwhelmingly vote to incorporate Central Lithuania into Poland. Founded in November of 1918 by Jonas Senulvicius, a former soldier in the Russian Imperial Army, Perloja is a town in Lithuania. It would have an army of 300 people at its peak. The Republic of Perloja was annexed by Poland and Lithuania in 1923. Iskalet was founded on July 29, 1917 in Riga, Latvia by Bolsheviks in the city. It would be annexed by German forces in February of 1918 and disbanded in March of 1918. Northwest Russia was founded on October 10, 1918 and was disbanded by the Estonian government on November 5, 1919. Northwest Russia would lead an offensive towards Petrograd with the help of Estonia. This would fail and they would be pushed back. The Commune of the Working People of Estonia would be founded on November 29, 1918 after the Battle of Narva, and would be annexed on June 5, 1919. Their leader would be Jan Anvalt. They'd be defeated handily in January of 1919. They'd exist as a government in exile up until June 1919, when the Bolsheviks got rid of them. The Duchy of Kurland and Smigalia was a German client state that was in place of Latvia, and would be formed on March 3, 1918. It would be absorbed into the United Baltic Duchy on September 22, 1918. April 12, 1918 saw the Provincial Assembly, the governing body of the United Baltic Duchy, asking for recognition from the German Empire so they could become a protectorate of Germany. They would get that recognition on September 22, 1918. November 5, 1918, a Regency Council would form. The Regency Council would name Duke Adolf Frederick of Mecklenburg as their leader. Their military was made up of the Iron Division that was a part of the Free Corps and the Baltic Landwehr. The Landwehr would be formed on November 18, 1918. May 22, 1919 would see the Iron Division capturing Riga. June 1919 saw the United Baltic Duchy being completely pushed out of Estonia. Then by July they would be dissolved. The Soviet Republic of Mysore was located on an island above Estonia, and would be founded on December 17, 1917. It would be annexed by Germany on February 26, 1918. The Latvian Socialist Soviet Republic was founded on December 17, 1918, and would be fully dissolved on January 13, 1920. The LSSR would be headed by Petrus Stuka, who would lead the entire existence of the Bolshevik Republic. They controlled Riga up until May 1919, when the Free Corps would take the capital. They were pushed out of Latvia by Latvian forces in January of 1920. The Finnish Socialist Workers' Republic would be founded on January 29, 1918, and would be dissolved by German and Finnish forces on May 5, 1918. The FSWR would be led by one chairman throughout the existence of the Republic, and that would be Kolervo Manor. The Karelian Labor Commune would be founded on June 8, 1920, and would be dissolved and combined into the Karelian Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic in 1923. The Republic of North Ingria was founded on June 9, 1919, would be annexed by Bolshevik forces on December 5, 1920. The North Ingrians would raise an army of 580 people, with some Estonian volunteers. Not a whole lot happened during the revolt. Skirmishes would happen up until December 5, 1920, when the Treaty of Tartu was signed, and the North Ingrians were disarmed and evacuated to Finland. The Olonets government was formed on May 15, 1918, and was combined into another government in October of 1920. The Karelian United Government would be formed from the Republic of Utua and the Olonets government of South Karelia on December 20th, when both former governments were in exile. It would be dissolved in exile in July of 1923. August 2nd, 1918 would see a coup. White Russians would successfully coup the Bolsheviks' regional government in the Karelian Northern Russia region. The leader of the administration would be Nikolai Tchaikovsky. It would move to a provisional government on September 28, 1918. The successor to the Supreme Administration would be founded on September 28, 1918, with Alexander Kolchak being the supreme ruler of the provisional government. The provisional government would be annexed by the Bolsheviks on February 21, 1920. The Khanate of Khiva was founded in 1511 and was annexed on February 2, 1920. At the beginning of the Russian Civil War, the Khan of Khiva would be Isandiyar Khan. He would lead up to October 1, 1918, and that's when the last Khan of Khiva would take over, Syed Abdullah. He would lead up to the annexation of Khiva. Khiva at the time was a protectorate of the Russian Empire. 1918 would see a successful coup in the Khanate due to lack of reforms from Iskandar. This would put in Syed Abdullah. November 24, 1918 would see the siege of Petro-Alexandrovsk and would end on December 5, 1918. The siege would result in the defeat of Khiva, though elements of their government would still exist beyond this point. 1919 would see some unsuccessful uprisings from the Bolsheviks in Khiva, though by February 1920, Syed Abdullah would abdicate the throne and Khiva would be overthrown by the Bolsheviks. The Turkestan Autonomy was founded on November 27, 1917, would be annexed by the Bolsheviks on February 22, 1918. Their first leader would be Mahomed Zon Tinian-Shapiev, though this would be brief, as his successor would be Mustafa Shokai, and he would lead Turkestan Autonomy to the end. The Trans-Caspian Provisional Government was a pro-white government founded on July 12, 1918 by Fyodor Funikov. They would be responsible for the killing of the 26 Baku Commissars. The TPG would see involvement in the Melanson Mission, a British-led offensive in Central Asia. When the British withdrew in 1919, the Trans-Caspian government struggled to hold on to the region they controlled. and eventually would lose their capital, Ashgabat, and would eventually be fully annexed by the Bolsheviks. The TASSR would be founded on April 30th, 1921, and was a combination of the Trans-Caspian Provisional Government and the Turkestan Autonomy. The Turkestan Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic would be broken up on October 27th, 1924. The Khorasan People's Soviet Republic would be what came after the Khanate of Khiva. Their first chairman would be Pavel Nanyaz Yusupov. He would lead up until 1921. The Khorasan PSR would see 10 more chairmen over the next 3 years. They would be given to two different republics, the Uzbek SSR and Turkmen SSR. The Bukharan People's Soviet Republic was Bolshevik-controlled Bukhara. The Bukhara PSR would be established on October 8, 1920, and would be dissolved into Turkmen SSR and Uzbek SSR on February 17, 1924. The Russian Republic was proclaimed on September 14, 1917, and would be dissolved on January 19, 1918. Alexander Kerensky would lead it from September to November 1917. Past this point, the Republic did not have a leader. It would be dissolved on January 18, 1918. The Idel-Ural state proclaimed its independence on March 1, 1918, and was founded by Sadri Maksudi Ersal. It would only last up to March 28, 1918, when it would be annexed by the Bolsheviks. Bashkiria would declare autonomy on November 28, 1917, and initially they would be led by Yunus Bikbov up until 1918. His successor would be Sajid Mursov, who would lead up until their change of government in 1919. The Bolsheviks in the region, in an attempt to shut down any form of pro-white government, would kill everyone who was a part of a local Bashkir council. Even though Lenin proclaimed the Bashkirs as neutral and non-counter-revolutionary, the Bolsheviks and Bashkirs' issues would continue to pile up. This would culminate in the Bolsheviks taking the capital of Orenburg in June 1918. The capital of Bashkiria would move to Chelyabinsk. Back in May, the Central Asian countries would make plans to make a union of Eastern Russia, though this would never make it to the formation stage of this plan. Bashkir's army in 1919 would be dissolved by the White Army, which forced them into negotiations with Bolsheviks. They would then turn over to them on March 20th, 1920. The Provisional Regional Government of the Ural would be formed on August 13, 1918 by Pavel Ivanov after the Czechoslovak Legion took the city of Ekaterinburg. October 26, 1918 would see the government dissolving themselves to give to the Provisional All-Russian Government. September 23, 1918 would see the PARG being formed from the ashes of the Russian Provisional Government. November 17, 1918, Alexander Kolchak would orchestrate a coup in the provisional government, which the coup would be successful, and a new government would form 2 years after the coup. The Provisional Siberian Government, which was one of the two provisional governments with the name, it would succeed the Russian Republic after its collapse. The Vladivostok government would be founded in January 1918. It would last up to October 1918 when it would fully be dissolved. The Omsk government would part ways with the Vladivostok government over political differences. The Vladivostok government would refuse to recognize the government. It was couped by Alexander Kolchak, and both governments would combine to form the Russian state. The Constituent Assembly was founded in Samara, Russia on June 8, 1918, after the Czechoslovak Legion would take the city. The chairman would be Vladimir Volsky. The government was overthrown by Alexander Kolchak in September of 1918. Eastern Ukraine is what came after the Russian state fell. Eastern Ukraine would be founded on January 16, 1920, with the leader being Grigory Semyonov. It was annexed by the Far Eastern Republic on October 28, 1920. The Priere-Marie government was essentially a Japanese puppet state that broke away from the Far Eastern Republic on May 27, 1921. The government was mostly made up of Semyonov supporters. Their first leader was Spiridon Merkulov, who led from 1921 to 1922. His successor would be Mikhail Diderix, who led from June 22, 1922 to October 1922. Then the final leader would be Anatoly Pepeyev, who would lead up to June 16, 1923, when it would be annexed by the Soviet Union. Uriankai Krai was a protectorate of the Russian Empire that got its protectorate status on April 17, 1914. The leader would be known as an Amban Noyan, and the person at the time of the Russian Civil War who was leading was Oyan Kombu Dorzu Oglu Sodunam Balchur. It would change government on August 14, 1921, and become a part of the Tuvan People's Republic. The Confederated Republic of Altai was founded in March of 1918. It was an attempt at rebuilding the Mongol Empire. The initial plan was to include not just Altai, but also Tuva and Caucasia. This would not end up happening. Their leader would be Grigory Gherkin. It would be annexed by the White Army in 1920, but would continue partisan warfare up until April 1922, when the Bolsheviks put an end to the partisan movement in Altai. Yakutia would form from a revolt of the Yakut population in Buryatia. The Yakut revolt would start in February of 1918. The Soviets would overthrow the government on July 1st, 1918. The state of Buryat Mongolia would form on April 25, 1917, and would serve as a buffer state between Bolshevik and White forces in Siberia. It would be absorbed into the Far Eastern Republic in 1921. After Alexander Kolchak had been overthrown in 1920, the Maritime Territory would be formed on January 31, 1920. Their capital would be Vladivostok. The provisional government would essentially serve as a buffer state for Japan. It would turn into the Priere-Marie government, and part of its territory would go to the Far Eastern Republic. Green Ukraine would be founded on June 24, 1917, and would declare independence in April of 1918. Initially, it would be declared in January of 1918 as a part of the Ukrainian state. 1920, Grigory Semyonov would recognize its independence. Yuri Halushko would be the leader of Green Ukraine for its entire existence. It would be annexed by the Far Eastern Republic in 1922. The Tungus Republic is considered the last white holdout in the Soviet Union. White-aligned rebels on May 10, 1924 would capture the town of Nelkan, and on the same day would capture the port city of Ayan. It wouldn't be until July 14th they would proclaim the Tungus Republic. They would exist up until May 9, 1925, when they would have successful peace negotiations with the Yakut ASSR, which was a part of the Soviet Union. The Erzincan Soviet was a Bolshevik-controlled city in Turkey founded in 1916. It would be de-established on February 13, 1918 by Ottoman forces. The Persian Socialist Soviet Republic was a Bolshevik-backed Persian state. It would be founded in May of 1920 and would be dissolved in September of 1921. Their only leader would be Mirza Kuchik Khan. The capital of the Persian SSR would be Rasht. The peasants in the region were outraged the Persian SSR did not redistribute the land in Gilan, where the Persian SSR controlled. This caused disagreements among the leaders in the Persian SSR, which would lead to the Bolsheviks to exert their influence in the region, and would cause the Persian SSR to force money out of the landlords and do anti-religious activities. February 1921 would see the Qajar Persians have a coup, with Fatollah Akbar being ousted from power. Along with this, the Persian SSR would be defeated as well. Mirza would flee into the mountains, where he would die of frostbite. The Provisional Yakut Regional People's Government would be the last official White Army government and would be located within the Ayano-Maysky district. The government would be formed on March 2, 1922 and would be dissolved on July 5, 1922. Before the formation of the government, remnants of the White Army in the region would conduct guerrilla warfare against the Bolsheviks. This would become successful enough where their force would grow to 1,000 people. There are no exact numbers on what the size of their force would be. After numerous defeats, the Yakutsk People's Army would dwindle to about 300 men by September 1922. August 30th, 1922 saw 750 members of the Siberian Volunteer Army led by Anatoly Pepelyayev joining the fight. It was planned to take the city of Yakutsk. Pepelyayev would take the city along with Ayan, Nelkan, and Okhotsk by December 31st. During that time of him taking those cities, the Soviet Union would form, and the area that Pepelyayev controlled would be the last area that wasn't controlled by the Soviets. February 14th to March 3rd, 1923 would see the Bolsheviks besieging Abaga, a village located within the territory Pepelyayev controlled. The Whites would lose control of the city. April onwards would see the Whites losing Okhotsk and Ayan in June of 1923. The Whites would give up Nelkan without bloodshed on June 19th, 1920. The Free State of Chukotka was founded on October 26, 1921, and depending on who you ask, it would later be dissolved in April 1922 when the Soviets occupied the capital. In 1924, when the Soviets began heavily cracking down on the idea of the Free State, or 1928 when the Chukchi people began participating in the Soviet government. December 16, 1919 is when the Bolsheviks first arrived in Chukotka, where they would seize the imperial administrator's post with little to no bloodshed. The same day, they would establish a revolutionary committee in the region. The revolutionary committee that was located in Anadyr, the capital, would interfere in the local fur trade that was quite lucrative for the local Chukchi. And on January 30th, 1920, the local Chukchi hunters, tired of the Bolsheviks, would surround the Revolutionary Committee's building. A firefight would break out, and one of the Bolsheviks would die, and the rest would be executed. Upon realizing what they had done, the Chukchi people would pose as the new Revolutionary Committee when it was asked what happened by local party officials by telegram. The deception would eventually be revealed. While some fled to Alaska upon hearing the Bolsheviks were coming, some would stay in Chukotka and form the Free State of Chukotka. Its control of the region would be brief, as the Bolsheviks would occupy the region in April of 1922, though partisan warfare would take place in Chukotka up until 1955. Kamchatka would be founded as a republic by a council of industrialists and its employees in March of 1918 in the city of Petropavlovsk, and would later be dissolved when Cossacks arrested the council members and took control of the city. The Transbaikal Republic would be founded on August 25, 1918, and would be dissolved on November 21, 1920. It would be founded by Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries, as well as a few other political groups. Grigory Semyonov would be the leader of the republic. January 1920 would see Semyonov negotiating with local white governments for complete power in Siberia to no avail. The ongoing threat of the Bolsheviks would be the downfall of the republic, as they would be annexed by Bolsheviks in October of 1920, and the government would be completely dissolved by November. October 26, 1917 would see people in the city of Harbin in China starting an uprising that was inspired by the October Revolution. Their leader would be Martymyan Ryutin. They would proclaim ownership over China's East Railway under the advice of Lenin. The Harbin Soviet would last up to December 26, 1917, when Chinese authorities raided their government buildings. The Rudabelle Partisan Republic would be founded in February of 1918 and would be dissolved in July of 1920. It would hold the areas of Babaruzk, Mozir, and Richitsa. It would be occupied by German forces initially in February of 1918. They would hold this occupation up until November of 1918. The partisans in the area would be protecting the villages from the Germans. August 1919 would see Polish troops occupying the region, where up until July 1920 they would carry out raids on Polish forces. Though, once the Polish had left the area, the Bolsheviks would attain the area and dissolve the republic. The Provisional Tarik Dagestan government would be formed on December 1st, 1917 and would dissolve in March of 1918. It would be controlled by local Tarik Cossacks. Their only leader would be Mikhail Karolov, who was a Tarik Cossack. He would later be killed by local Cossacks after making concessions to non-Cossack populations. This would pretty much bring an end to the republic. The Southeastern Union would be formed on November 2nd, 1917, and would be dissolved sometime in early 1918. The chairman of the Union would be Alexei Kildin. The Union of people from the Caucasus region would have the stated goal of fighting anarchy and Bolshevism. The main focus of the Southeastern Union would have been protecting local Cossack interests. Though once the Bolsheviks established power in the region, the idea of the Southeastern Union would fade and eventually be annexed. The Khotan state would be formed on April 23, 1919, and it would be formed in the Kizhinski district in Buryatia, Russia. The idea behind the Khotan state was that it would be a theocratic state for Buddhism in Buryatia, and it was to be modeled after the Tibetan government. It was led by Lubsan Sadan Saidinov, who was a Buryat Lama, Lama being a leadership title in Buddhism. The government would be arrested by White Army soldiers because Saidinov forbade anyone joining the White movement in Buryat on May 11, 1919. Though the state dissolved, Saidinov would remain a leader of the movement in Buryat up until May 15, 1922, where he died of pleurisy. His followers would partake in partisan warfare up until 1927. The Kaluga Soviet Republic was formed in February of 1918 by Bolsheviks, where they would appoint Peter Vidolin as leader. Vidolin would lead from February 5, 1918 to April 26th of the same year. He was succeeded by Pavel Skorbach, who led from April 26 to July 1918. The KSR's demise would come after they would raid a monastery in April and would turn into a drinking binge. The action of drinking would make the KSR lose favor with the Bolsheviks, and eventually the Bolsheviks would view the KSR as a non-territorial entity, and the idea of the KSR would finally dissolve after Skorbach left the region without much explanation. The Amur Socialist Soviet Republic would be founded on April 10, 1918 by Bolshevik forces in the Amur region, with its leader being Fyodor Mukin. It would last up to September 18, 1918, when it would be annexed by white forces. The Kazan Soviet Republic would be founded in February of 1918 and would be dissolved by the local Bolshevik Committee on May 16, 1918. The South Ossetia Autonomous Oblast would be founded on April 30, 1922, and would be part of the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic up until 1990. The Abkhaz Soviet Socialist Republic would be formed on March 31, 1921, and would be dissolved into Georgia on February 21, 1931. The first leader of Abkhazia would be Ephraim Eshba, a local Bolshevik leader. The Abkhaz SSR would form after the Bolsheviks invaded Georgia in 1921. The Nakhichevan ASSR would be formed on March 16, 1921, and would see its groundwork laid when the Bolsheviks invaded Armenia and Azerbaijan in 1921. The ASSR would be put under the governing of Azerbaijan in 1924, and the Nakhichevan ASSR would exist up until the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Bessarabian SSR would be formed on May 5, 1919 in Odessa, with the Soviets not recognizing the union of Romania and Bessarabia. The Bessarabian SSR would lose its territory and be disbanded in September of 1919. The Kalmyk Autonomous Oblast would be formed in November of 1920 and would remain an autonomous oblast up until 1935, when it would become an ASSR. The Shavash Autonomous Oblast would be formed on June 24, 1920 and would include the provinces of Kazan and Simbirsk, last up to April 21, 1925, when it would be turned into an ASSR. The Udmurt Autonomous Oblast would be formed on November 4, 1920 and would be formed into the Udmurt ASSR on January 1, 1932. The Yakut ASSR would be formed on April 27, 1922, with its capital being Yakutsk. It would last up until the collapse of the Soviet Union. November 30th, 1922 would see the Chechen Autonomous Oblast being formed, with the capital being Grozny. It would be combined into the Ingish Autonomous Oblast on January 15th, 1934. The Oirat Autonomous Okrug would be formed on June 1st, 1922, after it was separated from the Altai region in Siberia. It lasts up until January 7, 1948, when it was formed into the Gorno-Altai Autonomous Oblast. The Kabardino-Balkarian Autonomous Oblast would be formed on January 16, 1922, and would be turned into an ASSR on December 5, 1936. The Komi-Zyryan Autonomous Oblast would be established on August 22, 1921. It would be formed into the Komi ASSR in 1936. The Mari Autonomous Oblast would be formed on November 4, 1920, and it would form into the Mari ASSR on December 5, 1936. The Provisional Fergana government would be formed on October 22, 1919, and would be annexed by the Turkestan ASSR on March 6, 1920. It was led by Mandim Bek, who was a leader in the Basmachi movement. The Turkestan ASSR was formed on April 30, 1918, with their capital being Tashkent. The republic would be broken up into several separate ASSRs on October 27, 1924. The TSFR would be a combination of Georgian, Armenian, and Azeri states that would form on March 12, 1922. Their first leader would be Mikhail Tsikakaya. The TSFR would last up to December 5, 1936. The Adjarian Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic was founded in March of 1921 after Georgia had been annexed by the Bolsheviks. It lasted up to 1990 when the Soviet Union collapsed. The Volga-German ASSR would be founded in October of 1918, with Ernst Reuter being the leader of the Volga-German ASSR. The majority of Volga Germany would remain in control of the Bolsheviks for most of the Russian Civil War. It would last up to August 28, 1941, when the German population would be deported from Volga Germany by Stalin. The Dagestan ASSR would be established in 1921 and would last up to the end of the Soviet Union in 1991. The Tatar ASSR would form on May 27, 1920 and would last up to 1990. So all I really know about the Republic of Black Ural and Evenkia is that the Republic of Black Ural was located in the city of Magnitogorsk, and the Evenikas were Evenks were like a ethnic group in Russia. They still are, but so I'd assume they would form some kind of say, as most ethnic groups in the Russian Civil War did. So I'm not sure, I can't find anything on these, so if someone could help me with that, I would very much appreciate it. Thank you, if you can find anything about these. Thank you. Green armies were mostly against the Bolshevik government, but there were green armies that were against the white government. And they were mostly consisting of peasants and people who were not aligned with either the two main factions. March 1918 through April 1918 would see the first of the uprisings in Bursk district and Ufa governorate. These uprisings would start because the Bolsheviks would confiscate most of the bread out of Bursk district. June 1918 would see more uprisings start in Ufa governorate because of food requisition, lack of financial stability, and the Bolsheviks mobilizing their forces. The Green Army would name themselves the People's Army of Kamuch. The People's Army would establish contact with the Czech Legion and do joint operations with each other against the Bolsheviks. More uprisings that will be covered later happened in 1920. In spring of 1921, more uprisings would happen within Bashkir, though the local army in Bashkir would stamp this out in June of 1921, arresting and convicting all leaders. The Shechna uprising started on December 1st and went through December 4th, 1918 in the Volgota Governorate and the Sharapovet Governorate. The fighting would happen because peasants in the governorates of Volgota and Sharapovet would fight back against the Bolsheviks due to the Bolsheviks' food policy. The uprisings were led by a group of upper-class peasants located within the governorate. December 1st would see the beginning of the uprising, with it starting in the towns of Bratkovo, which is considered the center of the uprising. Chorokovsky and Bolchi Pochinok were also areas where the uprising happened. The peasants' main demand was that they did not want to participate any longer in the Civil War. The same day, the peasants would attack a train station that was located in one of the towns on the Shechna River. The rebels would attack the train station and kill 65 of the Bolsheviks' railway guard. The rebels would dismantle 170 meters of railway. December 2nd would see Bolsheviks sending soldiers to take the railway station. They'd be ambushed by the Green Army on their way to the village of Sharaport, and along with strong resistance to the attack. December 3rd would see rebels in the village of Bratkova, which was their stronghold, being attacked by the Bolsheviks. The village would be taken. December 4th would see all leaders of the rebellion executed. The Chapin War on March 3rd, 1919 would see the Bolsheviks taking more grain than required from the Samara governorate. This would obviously lead to a massive outrage from the peasants in the governorate. The peasants would demand an explanation and protest would ensue. The Bolsheviks would call more soldiers into the town. As the peasants would learn of more Bolsheviks coming into the town, they would disarm the Bolsheviks who were in the town and kill them. March 7th would see the Greens capturing the city of Stavropol and would name Alexei Dolinin as their leader. Dolinin would take down all signs of the previous government in the city. The Bolsheviks during this time would begin drawing up plans to attack Stavropol, with the 4th Red Army being chosen to attack the city. March 9th, these plans would be delayed because there's internal conflict within the 4th Red Army's reserve regiment. March 10th would see these issues resolved, and the attack on the rebel-controlled territory began. March 13th would see the Bolsheviks surrounding and besieging Stavropol. The Bolsheviks would take the city on the same day. Within the next few days, the few villages the Greens controlled would be taken, and by mid-April the rebellion would be fully stamped out. The Yuriev Polish Uprising happened on July 11th, 1919, and it would only last the day. It would see peasants in the Yurievsky district in Vladimir province overthrow the Bolshevik government, with Efim Sokorodumov leading the rebellion. The Yushkovites, who this Green Army would be called, would take the city of Yuriev Polsky. They would take the city with little resistance and take the little number of Bolshevik soldiers there as prisoner. Yuriev Polsky would be taken back by the Bolsheviks on the same day. The Bashtan Uprising would start on September 16, 1919 in the village of Petrakova. The reasoning behind this uprising was purely because of anti-Anton Denenkin sentiment in the region. The people who were behind the uprising were the Borotbis, who were the Ukrainian left socialist revolutionaries. It would be stamped out pretty quickly by Denenkin's forces, and would continue as partisans up until November 18, 1919, when the Bolsheviks rolled through the region. February 7, 1920 would see the Bolsheviks attempting to forcibly take grain in the village of Novoye. The peasants would take exception to the Bolsheviks doing this and would kill the Bolsheviks that attempted such. This would in turn cause the arrest of the people who had done this. There would be negotiations over the next few days between the peasants and the Bolsheviks. February 9th would see the peasants being freed from imprisonment along with the killing of the people they were negotiating with. The next day, 3,000 peasants would rally under Alexei Milovanov and would attack the city of Zainsk. Zainsk would become the headquarters for the rebels. February 22nd, the rebels would take the village of Atkish. 800 people would be killed in the fighting for the village. March 4th, 1920 would see 10,000 rebels, with only less than 1% of them actually having firearms, while the rest were armed with pitchforks, sticks, and rocks, leading an offensive on the city of Bursk and the villages of Moskovo, Lyaputino, Elyak, and Elyak. This offensive would fail and would lead to the downfall of the Pitchfork Rebellion. After this offensive, they would turn to partisan warfare and be defeated shortly thereafter. The Arsk Uprising was an uprising of Tatar peasants in the village of Arsk. It would begin on October 25, 1918 and would end on November 15, 1918. The uprising would begin because of the Bolsheviks' food requisition policy. November 10th, the rebels would capture Arsk and would be subsequently defeated on November 15th by the Bolsheviks. The Dagestan Uprising would begin in September of 1920 and would end on March 15, 1921. Before the uprising had happened, the general tone of mountain rebels was to support the Bolsheviks, but once the Bolsheviks had taken Dagestan, that support had changed to hostility. Rebels who came from Georgia set up in the valleys of Andy and Avar Koisas. The Bolsheviks would send a force of 1,000 men in response. The rebels would beat them back as they built a force of 6,000 men up in the valleys. October saw the rebels capturing a bridge in between the towns of Kunzak and Gunib, cutting communication between the towns from each other. The rebels would do half-hearted attempts at capturing the towns, but none of this was successful. The rebels would capture the town of Arkani, though the Bolsheviks would besiege the town on October 30th. The Bolsheviks would be defeated decisively at this battle, with them losing 700 men they had. November 4th, the Bolsheviks would bring 2 regiments from Baku as relief forces for the forces in Ganib and Kunzak. The rest of the fighting in 1920 would see the Bolsheviks making small gains, then being forced back to Kunzak. January 2nd, 1921 would see the Bolsheviks taking 140 prisoners in the village of Kanzalmiki. January 7th, 1921, Bolsheviks attacked the village of Gurgabil, the Dagestani rebels would hold out till January 26, when the village fell in a night attack. February 14th, 1921 would see the Bolsheviks bombing the village of Gimri. The rebels would surrender shortly after. After this point, the rebels controlled very little in Dagestan, and the Bolsheviks would stamp the insurgency in Dagestan out by March 15th, 1921. The Minushinsk uprising was an uprising of Bolshevik-aligned peasants and would be led by V. Ushchikov. The uprising would begin on November 9th, 1918 and would end on December 7th, 1918. The uprising would start because of the forced conscription into the White Army. The village of Dubinsko would be taken by the rebels at the very beginning of the rebellion. November 11th would see the rebels capturing the city of Karatuz. November 19th, the rebels being led by Oshchikov would attack the city of Minushinsk, where the white stronghold was in the region. 10,000 peasants would attack the city, with only 2,000 having firearms. By November 21st, the rebels would take heavy losses, being repelled from Minushinsk. Low-level insurgency would take place up until December 7th, when the uprising would be defeated. The Sorokino Rebellion, also called the Kulak Rebellion of Sorokino, would start in January of 1921 due to the tax policies of the Bolsheviks. The Sorokino Rebellion would mostly affect the areas of northern and eastern Altai. The rebels would be subsequently defeated in February of 1921, as the Bolsheviks were far more organized and had superior firepower. There was some fighting after the fact, but it would be totally liquidated in March of 1921. The Livny Uprising would take place in August of 1918 and would only last 2 days. The uprising would be caused by the food requisition policies of the Bolsheviks. Ivan Kloyapov, who was a former Soviet official and a member of the Left Socialist Revolutionary Party, on August 18th would lead an assault with a force of 11,000 villagers on the city of Livny. The Bolsheviks, not having a big presence in the city military-wise, would lose the city on August 19th. August 20th would see the Bolsheviks showing up with an armored train and a strong force, where they would kill the crowd of people that confronted them, as well as killing most of the leaders of the rebellion. The city would fall on the same day. As for Kloyapov, he would escape the city, though he would not be seen or heard from again. Zapushkov's uprising was led by Alexander Zapushkov, who was a lieutenant within the White and Red Army at different points. While he would be initially part of the White Army, he would defect like many officers to the Red Army. It is believed that the uprising had happened due to the removal of Zapushkov from his position within the Red Army due to his drinking problem. Others were removed due to this problem as well. The fighting would begin on July 14th with an offensive on the city of Buzuluk. The fighting would last for an hour before the Zapushkovites would take the city and rout the Bolsheviks. Once the uprising became known, the Bolshevik Central Committee made several attempts to contact Zapushkov to no avail. The Bolsheviks would be slow to suppress this uprising. This would cause the surrounding villages to be captured by August. The Bolsheviks would begin to deal with it after this point. August was very detrimental for the Zapushkovites, as they were defeated decisively in several battles. So September 6th, outside the village of Koim, Zapushkov would be shot dead by the Bolsheviks. The Zapushkovites would fight until September 22nd, 1920, where the rebellion would be crushed. The Tambov Rebellion started on August 19th, 1920, and would end sometime in mid-1922. Alexander Antonov, who was a political activist, a part of the Left Socialist Revolutionary Party, was the leader. Antonov would previously be arrested for blowing a train up, But before his sentence would be finished, he would be given amnesty by the whites and returned to his city of Tambov. Though he would later join opposition to the whites due to the whites' lack of agrarian reform. In the summer of 1919, Antonov would flee into the forest of Tambov, where he and people who fled with him would kidnap and murder Bolshevik political activists in the region. Over the summer of 1919, his group grew in size, with more and more people deserting for the Red Army in the region. August 19th, 1920 would see the start of the rebellion in the town of Kuritovo, where Red Army soldiers were requisitioning food from. They would kill and force the Bolsheviks out of said town. Other villages, upon hearing of this, would join the rebellion. The peasants, with few being armed with rifles, would attack Red Army detachments with pitchforks and other farm equipment. After the successful uprising in these villages, the people of the villages would make their way to the capital of Tambov Governorate, Tambov. They'd be stopped just outside the city. It'd be at this point that Alexander Antonov would take lead in the rebellion and would start organizing the rebels into proper regiments. It would shortly be after that the people in Voronezh, Saratov, and Penza would join the rebellion. By October 1920, the Antivists would take almost absolute control of the rural regions of Tambov. November 5th, 1920 would see 3,500 Antivists attacking the Sampur railway station along with the railways around Sampur. This would fail. January 1921 would see 250 Antivists attacking the town of Borisogoliptysk. Again, this would fail. By March, the Bolsheviks would lose almost all influence in the region. Due to this loss of influence, the Bolsheviks would send 75,000 Red Army soldiers along with Cheka detachments into the region. May 31st, the Bolsheviks would send armored vehicles into the village of Devsestrivity, with them capturing the rebels off guard in the village, with them being decisively defeated in the village. June 12, 1921, the general of the Bolsheviks, Mikhail Tukhachevsky, in the Tambov region, would request permission to use chemical weapons on the rebels in the region. This would be granted. The use of chemical weapons would crush the Antivists by the end of June, though it would take until 1922 to fully crush the rebellion. October 1920 saw Ivan Kolesnikov organizing 15,000 rebels in the village of Staraya Kalitova due to Bolsheviks' food requisition. October would see Kolesnikov and his men fighting with the local Bolshevik police and small detachments of Red Army soldiers. After the initial uprising, the anti-Bolshevik sentiment would spread to the neighboring villages. The main focus of the Kolnikovites was to fight off the food requisition detachments from the Bolsheviks. November 1920 would see the Red Army troops being sent into the region to suppress uprisings. The Red Army detachment would be annihilated, with survivors being taken prisoners. The Kolnikovites on November 25th would raid the town of Bogchar. They'd defeat the Bolsheviks in the town, but would not stay in the town. December of 1920 would see the Bolsheviks moving into Voronezh government, with the rebels putting a stiff resistance up. It would be on December 2nd, 1920, the Red Army cavalry would arrive and ease up the resistance for the infantrymen. On the night of the same day, the Kolnikovites cavalry would launch a counteroffensive on several villages located within Voronezh. The Red Army would retreat from the villages they held onto. The Bolsheviks did not have any idea of the scale of the uprising, with the Bolsheviks entering the village of Skarnovka on December 11th. The officers of this detachment of the Bolsheviks would stay in a house on the edge of the village. In the middle of the night, the Kolnikovites would surround the house with the officers in it. They would wait till the morning, when a firefight would break out between the Kolnikovites and the Bolsheviks. It would not last long, with the officers and soldiers, a part of the Bolshevik detachment, being slaughtered. December 13th would see the battle at a nearby farm where 600 Kolnikovites resided. The Bolsheviks, upon hearing this, would attack the farm and the village, with the battle lasting up to December 15th, with only 6 of the Kolnikovites making it out of the area alive. After this, the Bolsheviks believed they had stamped the rebellion out, even reporting that it had been crushed, though they would quickly find out that this was wrong. December 19th through 24th would see Kolesnikov and his supporters launching a new offensive on the Borcharsky and Ostrogovsky districts, occupying 3 villages. December 28th would see the Kolnikovites capturing a Red Army artillery base. By January 1921, the rebellion would number 50,000 people. February 1921, 24,000 Red Army soldiers would enter the Voronezh Governorate. February 1921 would also see some Kolnikovites joining up with Antonovites, who were in the region after Kolnikovites would occupy Novokorpursk for less than a day. March 5th, 1921 would see the Kolnikovites meeting Bolsheviks near the Zhurtevka station, where they would inflict heavy casualties on the Bolsheviks. The Kolnikovites would continue their activities through April, defeating the Bolsheviks in villages around the governorate of Voronezh and Tambov. Eventually in May, the Bolsheviks would catch up with Kolesnikov sometime in May. It isn't exactly known how he died, but in both versions of the story of his death, he'd either be killed in a battle sometime in the beginning of May or on May 12, 1921. It wouldn't be long after the Cheka would infiltrate their movement and dismantle it in October of 1921. The Akulevsky Uprising lasted from January 1921 through February 5th, 1921, and it would see Shavash people having an uprising in the Shavash Autonomous Region. There was no central leader of the uprising. The uprising would take place exclusively in the village of Akulevo. The Bolsheviks would quickly shut the uprising down, with them defeating the rebels within the village. January 31st, 1921 through December 1922 would see the West Siberian uprisings, which would take place in the Tyumen, Omsk, Chelyabinsk, and Sverdlovsk. Parts of northern Kazakhstan were also involved as well. The first of the revolts would take place in the village of Chelnovskom in Tyumen government. It would be shortly after it would spread to the regions of Akmola, Omsk, Chelyabinsk, Tobolsk, Tomsk, and Yekaterinburg. The Bolsheviks would lose most of the control in these regions. As many as 100,000 people were involved in these uprisings. The uprisings were caused by the clampdown on remnants of the Kolchak government by the Cheka. April 28th saw Greens attacking the town of Armashevo with 10,000 people. The Greens would be routed on May 1st, 1921, with 5,700 of the Greens being captured. After this victory, the Reds would gain control of the majority of the regions fairly quickly. By December 1922, the rebellion would be stamped out. The Kronstadt Rebellion would start on March 1st, 1921, with an insurrection, with Baltic Fleet sailors participating in the city of Kronstadt on Kotlin Island. Stepan Petrichenko would be the leader of Kronstadt. Stepan was also a member of the Baltic Fleet. He had had a previous attempt in forming a commune in Nysar in 1918. This would ultimately fail. Causes of the fighting would be once again food requisition policies of the Bolsheviks, as well as an economic downturn because of the Civil War, with protests happening in the region in January of 1921. Popularity in the early parts of the rebellion would explode in Kronstadt, due to the people of Kronstadt heavily aligning with the anarchist ideals. The people of Kronstadt view the Bolshevik centralization as unnecessary. The Baltic Fleet during this time had most of their sailors replaced with Ukrainian peasants, due to most of the Baltic Fleet sailors being moved to other areas of Russia to fight. This would cause the Baltic Fleet to have more anarchist sympathies due to the Ukrainian peasants not aligning with the Bolshevik ideals. More would come to these sailors as outbreaks of disease and lack of food hit the Baltic Fleet. It was initially thought that these protests would not cause a rebellion, but it would later cause such. Initially, Kronstadt would maintain uneasy but good relations with the Bolsheviks, with the Bolsheviks even sending a delegation to the island. This wouldn't last long as people in Petrograd began to protest. This caused the crews of the ships of the Sebastopol and the Petropavlovsk to hold an emergency meeting. Kronstadt would send a delegation to Petrograd to investigate the protests in Petrograd. Kronstadt would later demand a list of freedoms for the Bolsheviks that would later be denied. March 2nd would see Kronstadt purging the Bolsheviks from the island, with them arresting and killing a large chunk of Bolsheviks located on the island, with the rest of the Bolsheviks fleeing from the island. Due to the protests becoming violent, the Bolsheviks would crack down on Kronstadt and Petrograd, declaring martial law in the region. March 2nd would see 250 Kronstadt sailors going to Oranienbaum, though they would be forced to retreat due to Bolshevik machine gun fire. March 4th would see Bolsheviks voting to end the rebellion in a meeting of Petrograd Soviet leaders. Trotsky would immediately demand an ultimatum to the Kronstadt sailors to lay down their arms and surrender. March 7th would be the deadline for this ultimatum, and Kronstadt would not meet this deadline. Trotsky would sign Mikhail Tukhachevsky, who headed the attack on the island, with Cheka and normal Bolshevik infantry units. March 10th, Bolshevik air units would bomb the island, and these bombings would last up to March 14th, with small ground attacks from the Bolsheviks. March 16th through 17th would see Bolsheviks landing on the island, and by March 18th, the Kronstadt sailors would be defeated. The Tartar Uprising would begin on May 21, 1920, and would take place within the Tartar district in Azerbaijan. The uprising would be caused due to the Soviet occupation of the Caucasus, and would last up to May 24th, when the uprising would be crushed. The Left Socialist Revolutionary Uprising would begin on July 6, 1918, and would be led by Maria Spiridonova, Dmitry Popov, Mikhail Muravyov, and Yakov Blumkin, and would start in Moscow. The left socialist revolutionaries would be heavily against the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and the Bolshevik food requisition policy. In response to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the left SRs would assassinate the German ambassador Wilhelm von Mirbach. On the same day, the left SRs would occupy the Cheka's HQ building, with most members of the local Cheka siding with the left socialist revolutionaries. Lenin, upon hearing that this happened, thought the entire Cheka rebelled and would temporarily dismiss them. Lenin would get the Red Latvian Riflemen to launch an attack on the buildings, where the left SRs were located. The Cheka would be purged of left SRs. July 7th, Lenin would order the entire left SR faction in the 5th Congress of Soviets to be arrested, which was around 450 people. The same day, Bolshevik units would use artillery to push the left SRs out of the Cheka HQ. Dmitry Popov and left SR rebels they captured would all be executed. Petrograd also had smaller skirmishes that would be stamped out quickly by the Bolsheviks. After this, the entire congressional left SR delegation would be jailed. By the end of July 7th, all left SRs would be expelled from government offices. The Georgian-Ossetian conflict would begin in February of 1918 and would end in the summer of 1920. Ossetians, who are an ethnic group, called for their self-governance. The Ossetian peasants in February of 1918, who were under the TDFR at the time, refused to pay taxes to the TDFR, whose government was based in Georgia and was a Menshevik-led government. Small skirmishes would break out over the tax policies implemented. March 1918 saw the Ossetian rebellion growing in number, where they would even hold off an offensive by the Georgian army in the region. March 19th saw Ossetian rebels occupying the village of Sikan Valley, though by March 22nd the Georgians would take back the village. October 1919 would see a second uprising of Ossetians against the Menshevik-led government in the Upper Roka region. The South Ossetian National Council, which was the main governing body for the Ossetians at the time, would come to the negotiation table with the Georgians sometime in late 1919. The negotiations would go nowhere, and the Georgians would ban the South Ossetian National Council from operating due to their Bolshevik alignment. 1920 would see the South Ossetians having a subsequently larger uprising that would be backed by the Bolsheviks. March 7th, 1920, the Bolsheviks would be in violation of the Treaty of Moscow, which stated that it would respect the borders of Georgia by demanding that the Georgians remove their soldiers from South Ossetia. May 8th would see the South Ossetians forming a Soviet republic within the Roka region. The Bolsheviks would help by providing soldiers to the South Ossetians, though it would not be enough, and the Bolsheviks would eventually distance themselves from the rebellion. The Georgians in the aftermath would burn down Ossetian villages, killing thousands. In May 1919, Nikifor Ryhorov, who was an officer in the Red Army, a part of the 6th Ukrainian Soviet Division serving on the Bessarabian front, would help local peasants rebel against the Soviet government. The uprising would happen because of the food requisition and heavy oppression policies of people in the region. The rebellion would see murmurings in April when Ryhorov refused to carry out orders to march into the Bessarabian region. The same day would see riots from peasants due to the food requisition policies. Oppression in the city of Yelisavthrad would happen as well. Ryhorov would disarm the Bolshevik unit located in the city, along with demolishing the Communist Party of Ukraine's headquarters. Ryhorov would lead an offensive on the cities of Katerinoslav, Mykolaiv, and Kherson. There would also be a plan to attack Kiev and Kharkov. On May 10th, the Ukrainian SSR would respond to this attack by outlawing Ryhorov and the rebels that followed him. The rebels would also carry out pogroms in Ukraine after capturing Katerinoslav. May 20th would see Mykolaiv being captured by rebel forces. May 19th would see Ryhorov being defeated in Kamenka. May 22nd, the Bolsheviks would take Alexandria, which is the main center for Ryorov's rebellion. May 26th to May 31st would see Mykolaiv, Okachiv, and Kherson being captured. By June 1919, only 3,000 people remained of the 15,000 that were initially involved in Ryorov's army. During the same month, Nestor Makhno would meet with Ryhorov and would ask him to join his forces with Makhno's Black Army to fight both Red and Whites, which Ryhorov would agree to Makhno's terms. Ryhorov would later break the alliance with Makhno and consider joining South Russia, where he'd be killed by Makhno and his men for what they called treason. Pre-Russian Civil War, the Czechoslovak Legion would be fighting the Germans on the Eastern Front. The chairman of the Legion, Tomasz Masaryk, would begin preparing for the evacuation of the Legion when World War I came to a close. The Legion on May 14th would encounter a train full of Hungarians in Chelyabinsk. The Hungarians viewed the Legion as traitors, as Czechoslovakia was looking for independence from Austria-Hungary. A firefight would break out between the Hungarians and Czechoslovakians, with the Czechoslovakians defeating the Hungarians. This would cause the local Bolsheviks to arrest some of the Czechoslovak Legion members. The Legion would storm the railway station where the arrested men were, and would actually take over Chelyabinsk. Though the resolution to this would be peaceful, this would cut the Bolshevik railway link to Siberia. The Bolsheviks would try to use this as an excuse to disarm the Legion. Also, this attempt to disarm would also be because the Bolsheviks held the royal family in Yekaterinburg 140 miles away. This disarmament attempt would not go well, as the Bolsheviks would lose control over the region and the railway system. The Legion would occupy cities located on the Trans-Siberian Railway, with them being Petropavl, Kurgan, and Novo-Nikolaevsk. Nizhneudinsk and Kansk were also occupied. Due to these defeats of the Bolsheviks, it would enable anti-Bolshevik groups to establish themselves in the region in June of 1918. By autumn of 1918, the Legion would no longer be on the front lines of the Russian Civil War. Instead, they were said to guard the Trans-Siberian Railway. When the end of World War I came around, Czechoslovakia was freed from Austria-Hungary. The Legion had an even stronger desire to return to their newly formed homeland. The Legion would gather their troops in early 1919 and clear the area from Novo-Nikolaevsk to Irkutsk as a Czechoslovak zone of operation, interfering with the Whites' operations in the area. Also, I should add the Legion was a mostly neutral party. It's just that they were pushed into fighting the Bolsheviks on most occasions. 1920 would see the Czechoslovaks returning home, but at the cost of Alexander Kolchak, as the Bolsheviks guaranteed safe passage through their territory if they were to hand him over, which they did. The United Kingdom played a fairly small role in the Russian Civil War. While they were involved in Murmansk and Siberia, most of their doing was logistical support and not direct involvement. They did provide naval support to the Baltic countries during the Bolsheviks' invasion of the Baltic countries, but this would only last up to 1920. England would provide over 63,000 troops, in which only 1,000 had died. India would see themselves in the Melsun mission, helping the Trans-Caspian government, where they would push the Bolsheviks out of modern-day Turkmenistan. Canada, Australia, India, and South Africa's involvement all conceded with the UK at the time, as they were all dominions of the UK. The United States would provide 11,000 soldiers to the war effort in the Russian Civil War, with the 2nd Polar Expedition, or 339th Rifle Regiment, at the helm for the Americans. The Battle of Tolgas, which would take place on November 11th, 1918, and would end on November 14th. The battle would see 300 Americans as well as a mixture of Canadian, British, and Russian troops, which would number 300 as well, defending the village from 2,500 Bolsheviks. The battle would be decisively won by Allied forces, with them killing 500 of the 2,500 Bolsheviks in the 3-day period. The Allied forces would lose 30 men, with another 100 injured. January 19th through 25th would see the Battle of Shenkursk. There's no reliable information on casualties, but the Bolsheviks did ambush Allied forces consisting of British, Canadian, American, and Russian forces. The casualty count is all over the place, with Bolsheviks claiming over 2,000 people died in the battle, while the Americans claimed only 39. January 27th through early March 1919 would see the Battle of Vitstavka. The Bolsheviks up to this point had forced a 50-mile retreat of the Allied forces. The Bolsheviks would take the villages. The Battle of Boshi Ozerki would take place on March 31st and would involve Polish, British, and Russian and American troops. The Allied forces would inflict heavy casualties on the Bolsheviks, with them taking 2,000 casualties of the 7,000 they initially invaded with. The Allied forces would only take 75 casualties of their 2,000. July through August 1919 would see 3,520 of America's forces, backed by the USS New Orleans and the USS Albany, attacking 5,500 Bolsheviks located in Suchan, a town in Russia. The Americans would decisively win the battle, pushing the Bolsheviks out of the region. August 7th, 1919 would see a 40-man American patrol accounting a 30-man Bolshevik patrol in the town of Novolitovskaya, with the American patrol completely wiping out the Bolshevik patrol. January 8th, 1920 would see the Americans announcing that they would be pulling out of Siberia, and the next day on the 9th, Cossacks backed by the Bolsheviks would attack Americans located in the town of Polsoskaya. The Cossacks would ride into town on a train. The battle wouldn't last very long, with the Cossacks losing 5 men and 74 would be captured, as well as their train. The Americans would leave Russia in August of 1920. The first of the French involvement would come in December of 1917, with them landing in Ukraine providing 15,000 troops. They'd be heavily unprepared, so they would only take defensive positions during their time in Ukraine. The French would also land another 3,000 in Crimea. Though, in Crimea, they would take the cities of Kherson, Mykolaiv, Sevastopol, and Tiraspol. In August of 1918, the French would provide 500 soldiers to Siberia from their French Indochina colony. The Greeks would provide 23,000 troops to Crimea, helping the Allied forces in Crimea. The Greeks would withdraw after 3 months of fighting in Crimea. The Serbians would play a very small role in the Russian Civil War, only providing 2,000 soldiers. The Serbians' involvement would only be in North Russia. Italy would provide 2,500 soldiers from the Legione Redenta, who were former prisoners of war. They would spend all their time fighting in Siberia, protecting the Trans-Siberian Railway and fighting the Bolsheviks in Manchuria. Aside from fighting in Mongolia, the Republic of China would provide 2,300 soldiers to Vladivostok at the request of Chinese merchants. All of their involvement would be protecting the Chinese merchants in Siberia. Sweden would provide 750 soldiers to invade Åland in February of 1918. They would leave Åland in September of 1918. After Austria-Hungary fell apart, it would be split into many different countries. Hungary's involvement in the Russian Civil War would be logistical support for the Polish during the Polish-Soviet War. The Emirate of Afghanistan would provide diplomatic support to the Basmachi movement during the Russian Civil War, housing the leaders of the Basmachi movement the Bolsheviks wanted. Persia, who was a part of the Allied nations at the time, would house Russians and others fleeing the Bolsheviks. They would also provide volunteers to Azerbaijan to fight the Bolsheviks.